What if the numbers on this page, the paper it would have been printed on, and the credit in your bank account all trace back to a network of camel routes across Central Asia? What if the same road that carried silk also carried the plague that killed a third of Europe, and the ideas that rebuilt it afterward? This is Luminous Starlight Audiobooks, and this is the complete audiobook of The Road That Made the World. Chapter 1. 1. The Road That Wasn't a Road. What the Silk Road actually was, and why the name is a lie. The merchant's problem. The road did not exist. That is the first thing to understand. A Sogdian merchant in Samarkand in 600 CE who needed to move a bale of Chinese silk 4,000 miles to a buyer in Constantinople could not walk to a map and trace a line. There was no line. There was a chain, a Dunhuang trader who knew the desert, a Parthian family who controlled the Merv oasis, a Byzantine merchant who ran the Constantinople end, and between them a series of handoffs that no single person ever saw whole. The silk arrived. The money came back. Nobody had made the journey. Each link in the chain was a different world. The Chinese section ran from the capital through the Hashi Corridor, the narrow strip of habitable land between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert, to the garrison town of Dunhuang at the desert's edge. The desert crossing required camels, specifically the two-humped Bactrian camel, which could carry 300 pounds for 40 days without water, whose adapted feet spread on sand and gripped on ice, whose eyes could close against a sandstorm while remaining slightly open to navigate. Beyond the desert, the road fractured into mountain passes through the Pamas that required different animals, different knowledge, different languages. Beyond the Pamas, the Central Asian steppe introduced a third world, nomadic peoples whose relationship to the fixed routes of merchant caravans was complex and sometimes violent. The name Silk Road was invented in 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who needed a label for the routes he was mapping in preparation for German commercial expansion into Central Asia. He chose silk because it was the most glamorous cargo he knew about. The name stuck because it had the quality that good myths have. It was evocative, memorable, and misleading in exactly the right ways. The road was never primarily about silk. It carried paper and spices and glassware and horses and slaves and ideas and diseases. And it was never a road. What it actually was. What the Silk Road actually was is better described as a series of overlapping ecologies, each with its own logic. The oasis ecology, the string of towns that grew up around water sources in the desert, each one a node where goods changed hands, where merchants rested and replenished, where different languages and currencies met in the dusty chaos of a caravanserai. The steppe ecology, the grasslands north of the desert routes where nomadic peoples maintained parallel networks of their own, trading horses and furs and occasionally raiding the settled routes to their south. The mountain ecology, the high passes of the Pamas and Karakoram where the routes compressed into single threads controlled by whoever held the passes. The ecology that made it work was the human one, the network of trust relationships, credit arrangements, family connections, and linguistic competencies that allowed a merchant in one city to send goods through multiple intermediaries to a buyer in another city thousands of miles away, without ever making the journey himself. The Sogdian merchants who dominated Central Asian trade for 5 centuries did not travel the entire road. They settled in colonies at strategic nodes in Chinese cities, in Byzantine trading posts, in Persian market towns, and passed goods between their compatriots through a network of family and community trust that was the actual infrastructure of the road. This network was invisible to the people who benefited from it, just as the infrastructure of the internet is invisible to the people who use it. The Roman aristocrat who draped himself in Chinese silk had no idea how it had arrived, through how many hands, across how many deserts, by what combination of trust and calculation and risk. He knew it was expensive, which was partly the point. He knew it was beautiful. He did not know that the road that brought it was less like a highway and more like a living organism, constantly adapting, constantly finding any. He knew it was beautiful. He did not know that the road that brought it was less like a highway and more like a living organism. He did not need to know. That was the point. A case study, Dunhuang and what it preserved. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu was clearing sand from a cave complex at Dunhuang, the garrison town at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert that had been the last Chinese outpost on the Silk Road for 1,000 years. He broke through a sealed wall and found a room packed floor to ceiling with manuscripts, 50,000 documents in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, and a dozen other languages, sealed in the cave sometime around 1000 CE and forgotten for 9 centuries. The Dunhuang manuscripts are the most important archive of the Silk Road that exists, and they reveal a world that the phrase trade route does not capture. There are merchant accounts and Buddhist sutras and Taoist texts and Manichaean hymns and Nestorian Christian documents and astrological charts and medical prescriptions and love letters and administrative records and dictionaries for translating between languages that have no modern speakers. There are contracts for the sale of slaves and agreements for the lending of grain and documents recording the liberation of debt-bonded workers. There are the personal letters of Sogdian merchants, written in the early 4th century, describing the collapse of Chinese cities and the disruption of trade and the difficulty of getting money home to their families. The road did not exist. There was no line. There was a chain and the silk arrived, and the money came back, and nobody had made the full journey. What the Dunhuang cave preserved was not the grand narrative of civilizational exchange but the specific texture of ordinary life on the road, the anxieties of merchants far from home, the administrative burdens of garrison commanders, the spiritual needs of travelers who did not know if they would survive the next desert crossing. The Silk Road was not made by emperors or generals. It was made by the accumulated decisions of thousands of ordinary people who needed to move things from one place to another and found ways to do it across distances and barriers that should have been prohibitive. The camel and the compass. The specific technology that made the Silk Road possible before the invention of paper money and navigational instruments was the camel. Not the single-humped dromedary of the Arabian desert, which was adapted to heat and was the workhorse of shorter desert crossings, but the 2-humped Bactrian camel of Central Asia, which was adapted to both heat and extreme cold and could cross terrain that defeated every other pack animal. A Bactrian camel could carry twice the load of a pack horse, travel twice as far between water sources, and survive in temperatures ranging from -40 to +40 degrees Celsius. It was, for 1,000 years, the truck of the ancient world. The letters found at Dunhuang include a series written by a Sogdian merchant named Nunai-Dat sometime around 313 CE, describing the collapse of Chinese cities during the civil wars that followed the fall of the Han dynasty. His letters were never delivered. They were found in a watchtower near Dunhuang where they had apparently been abandoned, perhaps because the postal system had broken down along with everything else. They are among the oldest surviving personal letters in any Central Asian language, and they read with a specificity of anxiety about money owed, family members not heard from, trading partners who have disappeared that 7 centuries of distance have not made strange. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 2. 2. The Silk They All Wanted. China's 3,000-year monopoly, the smuggled eggs, and what silk really was. The secret that held for 3,000 years. The penalty for revealing the secret of silk was death. Not imprisonment, not exiled, death, for the farmer who described the silkworm, for the merchant who smuggled the eggs, for the official who looked the other way. For 3,000 years, the Chinese state enforced this penalty with enough consistency that the secret held. The Roman senators draping themselves in Chinese silk had no idea the fabric came from a caterpillar. The Byzantine emperors paying Persian merchants extortionate prices had no idea a worm was at the center of their financial dependency, and the world outside China waited 3 millennia for the information that a cocoon, dropped into a cup of tea, contained the finest thread nature had ever produced. The legend is almost certainly false. Silk production in China predates the Yellow Emperor by several thousand years. Fragments of silk have been found in archaeological sites dating to 3500 BCE, embedded in the soil in patterns that suggest the presence of woven fabric. But the legend captures something true. From very early in Chinese history, the knowledge of how silk was made, the cultivation of the Bombyx mori silkworm, the management of the mulberry trees that fed it, The complex process of unreeling the cocoon filament and weaving it into cloth was treated as a strategic secret, guarded by death penalties for those who revealed it, maintained for 3,000 years with a ferocity that has no parallel in the history of intellectual property. The silkworm itself enforced the secret almost as effectively as the death penalties. Bombyx mori is the most thoroughly domesticated insect on Earth. In 3,000 years of human management, it has lost the ability to fly, the ability to survive outside controlled conditions, and the camouflage coloring that would allow it to hide from predators. It is completely dependent on human care for its survival, which means that keeping the secret of its existence was, in practical terms, keeping the worm itself out of foreign hands. A secret you can imprison is much easier to keep than one that exists only in a document. What made silk worth the journey? The properties that made silk the most valuable textile in the ancient world are not immediately obvious to modern consumers who have never worn it. Silk is warm in winter and cool in summer because its fiber structure traps air at the microscopic level. It is extraordinarily stronger by weight than steel, which means a silk garment holds its shape and resists tearing in ways that linen and wool cannot match. It takes dye brilliantly, holding colors that would fade in other fabrics, which made it the medium through which the ancient world expressed its most extravagant visual imagination. And it has a luminous quality, a way of catching and reflecting light at multiple angles simultaneously, that is a direct product of the triangular cross-section of the silk fiber and that no other natural material replicates. In the ancient world, where the visual distinction between different social classes was enforced by strict sumptuary laws, silk was power made visible. A Roman senator wrapped in Chinese silk was not simply a man who had spent money on an expensive garment. He was a man who had demonstrated his access to a supply chain that stretched 4,000 miles across the known world, that passed through the hands of half a dozen civilizations, that was controlled at every point by people who would rather have kept it for themselves. Wearing silk in Rome was approximately the equivalent of owning a yacht. The garment itself was almost secondary to what the garment proved about the wearer. The Chinese understood this perfectly. They used silk as currency, paying soldiers in silk bolts, buying peace from nomadic neighbors with annual silk tributes, conducting diplomatic exchanges in which silk served as the visible measure of imperial wealth and generosity. The Silk Road did not exist primarily because Chinese merchants wanted to sell silk to foreigners. It existed because Chinese emperors needed to manage the political implications of the fact that their empire product the Silk Road did not exist primarily because Chinese merchants wanted to sell silk to foreigners. It existed because Chinese emperors needed to manage the political implications of having something that the rest of the world wanted more than anything else. That is a different kind of power. And it is a different kind of vulnerability. A case study: the monks and the smuggled eggs. In 552 CE, two Nestorian Christian monks arrived at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in Constantinople with an offer. They had spent years in Central Asia and claimed to know the secret of silk production. For the right payment, they could obtain the means to produce silk within the empire, ending Byzantium's crippling dependence on Persian middlemen who controlled the overland trade routes and extracted maximum profit from every bolt of Chinese silk that passed through their territory. Justinian, who was engaged in an enormously expensive series of wars to reconquer the Western Roman Empire and who was already paying the Persians extortionate prices for the silk that Byzantine court ceremony required, said yes. The monks returned to Central Asia, obtained silkworm eggs, concealed, according to the historian Procopius, in hollow walking staffs and brought them back to Constantinople. The eggs hatched. The mulberry trees that the monks also brought survived transplantation. Within a generation, Byzantine silk production had become the foundation of a state industry that would supply the courts of Europe for the next 7 centuries. The Chinese silk monopoly lasted 3,000 years. It ended because 2 monks hid silkworm eggs in hollow walking sticks and carried them across the Pamas. The story of the monks and the smuggled eggs is one of the most consequential acts of industrial espionage in history, and it illustrates something about the nature of monopoly that the history of technology repeatedly confirms. A secret that is kept by execution cannot survive indefinitely when it is worth enough to someone else to risk death to obtain it. The Chinese had maintained their silk monopoly through 3,000 years of death penalties, diplomatic management, and the biological imprisonment of the silkworm itself. They lost it to two monks with hollow walking sticks and enough determination to cross the Pamas twice. The silk that was not Chinese. The smuggled eggs transformed the political geography of silk. Within a century of Justinian's monks, Byzantine silk production had become sophisticated enough to produce fabrics that could compete with Chinese originals in quality and surpass them in the specific decorative vocabulary that Byzantine court ceremony required. The Persian Sassanid Empire developed its own silk industry. The Islamic caliphates that succeeded Persia became the most innovative silk producers in the medieval world, developing weaving techniques and pattern vocabularies that influenced Chinese production as much as Chinese production influenced theirs. By the time the Silk Road reached its medieval peak, the silk moving along it was as likely to be Persian, Byzantine, or Central Asian as Chinese. The road had taken the secret it was named for and distributed it across the world it connected, producing a global silk industry in which the original monopoly was a distant memory and the Chinese advantage was no longer in production but in the specific quality of the raw material. The particular characteristics of Chinese mulberry leaves and Chinese climate and thousands of years of selective breeding that gave Chinese raw silk a luster that imported production never entirely matched. The lesson the silk monopoly teaches is not about trade secrets or industrial espionage, though it teaches those things too. It is about the fundamental impossibility of indefinitely containing something that the world wants badly enough. The Chinese silk monopoly lasted 3,000 years, an extraordinary run by any measure. But 3,000 years was the limit. The road that it created outlasted the monopoly that created the road, and the world that emerged from the road's 1,000 years of operation was a world so thoroughly interconnected that the original secret had become irrelevant. What the road had transmitted was not silk. It was the idea that the world was connected. What silk meant everywhere. In China, silk was currency, tribute, and the visible measure of civilization. In Rome, it was erotic luxury. Julius Caesar scandalized the conservative Senate by appearing in a silk robe, and the satirists of the empire produced an entire literature of disapproval about the way silk clung to the female body, revealing more than it concealed. In Byzantium, it was the medium of sacred art and imperial authority. The particular purple silk reserved for imperial use was so jealously guarded that it was literally illegal for anyone outside the imperial family to wear it, and Byzantine purple silk robes were among the most politically significant diplomatic gifts an emperor could send. In the Islamic world, it was the material of paradise. The Quran describes paradise as a place where the blessed wear silk, and the Hadith traditions record that the Prophet wore silk on certain occasions while prohibiting it for men in daily life, a theological tension that Islamic jurists spent centuries trying to resolve. Each civilization's relationship to silk tells you something about that civilization's relationship to luxury, to pleasure, to the body, to the divine. The Chinese pragmatism about silk as currency contrasts with Roman anxieties about it as effeminacy. Byzantine theology's transformation of silk into sacred material contrasts with Islamic ambivalence about its earthly pleasures. All of these responses were shaped by the fact that silk came from somewhere else, that it was foreign in origin, mysterious in production, and available only to those with access to the vast network of exchange that was the road's real product. The Chinese silk monopoly lasted 3,000 years. It ended because two monks hid silkworm eggs in hollow walking sticks and carried them across the Pamas to a Byzantine emperor who needed a cheaper supply chain. 3,000 years of death penalties, diplomatic management, and the biological imprisonment of a caterpillar ended by two men with hollow sticks and a long walk. The road that the silk created outlasted the monopoly that created the road. The secret that had shaped the ancient world's economy became, in a few years, simply information. The worm was everywhere now. The road, having delivered it, kept running on different cargo. The last wild ancestor of the domesticated silkworm, Bombyx mandarina, still exists in China and Japan, feeding on wild mulberry trees. Experiments in crossing it with the domesticated Bombyx mori have confirmed that the two species have diverged significantly in the 3,000 years of domestication. The wild moth can fly, camouflage itself, and survive without human management, while its domesticated relative cannot do any of these things. The domestication of the silkworm is one of the most complete transformations of an animal species in the history of agriculture, comparable in its thoroughness to the domestication of the dog. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 3. 3. The Men Who Ran It. The Sogdian merchants and the world they built between two empires. The people nobody remembers. Walk into the foreign quarter of Chang'an in 700 CE and the first thing you notice is the faces. Long noses, green eyes, curling beards, features that belong to the steppes and mountains 4,000 miles west, attached to men who speak fluent Chinese, who have lived in this city for 2 generations, whose sons were born within the Tang city walls and will die here. They are Sogdians, the people who ran the Silk Road, who built the merchant colonies at every node on the route from Samarkand to the sea, who handled the goods and the money and the information that held the ancient world together. Nobody remembers them now. In the 7th century, nobody could have imagined a world without them. They were called foreigners, barbarians, and they ran the international trade of the most sophisticated economy in the world. The Sogdians came from Sogdiana, the region of Central Asia centered on Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They were not an empire, they never had a unified state, and their cities were governed by local rulers who were often subordinate to whoever was the dominant power in Central Asia at any given time: the Kushans, the Sassanids, the Hephthalites, the Western Turks, the Arabs. What they had instead of an empire was something more valuable for their purposes: a network. The Sogdian trading network stretched from China to Byzantium, sustained by family connections, shared language, shared religion. Most Sogdians were Zoroastrian, and a system of commercial trust that allowed a merchant in Samarkand to send goods to a cousin in Chang'an with reasonable confidence that they would arrive, be sold at the agreed price, and that the proceeds would eventually make their way back. The Sogdians ran the Silk Road for 5 centuries, from roughly 300 to 800 CE, and left almost no trace in the historical record that is familiar to most people today. They are not in the textbooks. Their language is extinct. Their cities are archaeological sites under the modern cities of Uzbekistan. They were written out of their own history by the peoples who eventually absorbed them, the Chinese on one end, the Arabs on the other, and by the convention of historical writing that focuses on the empires and ignores the networks that connect them. How the network worked. The Sogdian commercial network operated on a principle that modern economists would recognize as agency theory, a principle in one city entrusting an agent in another city with goods or capital, with the agent's compensation tied to the success of the transaction. What made this work across distances of thousands of miles and in the absence of any legal system that could enforce contracts between parties in different political jurisdictions was the same thing that has always made long-distance trade work: reputation. A Sogdian merchant who cheated a trading partner lost more than the profit from that transaction. He lost his place in a network that was the source of all his commercial opportunities, and in a community in which everyone knew everyone else's business, the loss was permanent. In a world without courts that crossed borders, reputation was the law. The Sogdian letters found at Dunhuang and at other sites along the road reveal a commercial culture in which the maintenance of trust was the primary obligation, letters that are full of anxious inquiries about the reliability of specific individuals, requests for information about market conditions in distant cities, and the occasional furious accusation against a partner who has failed to remit promised funds. The network was also a family business, in the most literal sense. Sogdian trading colonies in Chinese cities were organized around family groups, with the senior male relative in each colony coordinating the activities of the younger men who had come east to make their fortunes. Marriage alliances between prominent trading families created commercial partnerships that were simultaneously kinship obligations. The Silk Road, at the level of the people who actually ran it, was a family affair, a vast extended family stretching from Samarkand to Chang'an, maintained by the biological fact of kinship and the social fact of shared obligation. The end of the Sogdians. The Arab conquest of Central Asia between 650 and 750 CE transformed the religious landscape of Sogdiana but did not initially destroy the Sogdian commercial network. Arab governors needed the trade revenues that Sogdian merchants generated, and Sogdian merchants proved adaptable. Many converted to Islam, integrated into the new political order, and continued operating the network under Arab political authority. The coins they used changed. The prayers they said changed. The network itself persisted. What ended the Sogdian network was not conquest but assimilation. Over the 8th and 9th centuries, the distinctive Sogdian identity, the language, the Zoroastrian religion, the specific commercial culture was absorbed into the broader Islamic civilization that was reshaping Central Asia. The Sogdian language gave way to Persian. The Zoroastrian fire temples were converted to mosques or demolished. The family networks that had run the trade were reorganized into Islamic commercial structures that served the same function but no longer had a specifically Sogdian character. A Sogdian merchant who cheated a trading partner lost his place in a network that was the source of all his commercial opportunities. In a world without courts that crossed borders, reputation was the law. The Uyghurs, who dominated Central Asian trade in the 9th century after the Sogdians, and the Persian merchants who succeeded them, and the Turkic trading networks of the medieval period, were all heirs to the Sogdian system in the sense that they operated on the same principles: family networks, reputation-based credit, colonial settlements at trading nodes, even though they had no direct connection to Sogdiana itself. The Sogdians had invented the operating system of the Silk Road. The road kept running on it long after the people who wrote it had disappeared. What the Sogdians left behind. The legacy of the Sogdian merchants is everywhere and invisible. The Uyghur script, which became the basis for the Mongolian script, which became the basis for the Manchu script, derives from the Sogdian alphabet. The commercial practices that the Sogdians pioneered, letters of credit, agency arrangements, long-distance family partnerships, became the template for Islamic commercial law and, through it, for the commercial law of medieval Europe. The Nestorian Christian churches that the Sogdians built in their trading colonies across Central Asia and China carried Christianity further east than any other branch of the faith and left traces in the religious cultures of Mongolia, China, and India that persist to this day. The food that traveled with the Sogdians changed the cuisines of the civilizations they passed through. The peach, the pear, the apricot, the pomegranate, the walnut, the sesame, all of these moved from their Central Asian origins into China and the Mediterranean world along the Sogdian trading network, carried as food for the journey and planted at stopping points along the route. The word peach in most European languages derives from the Latin persicum, Persian fruit, reflecting the route by which it arrived in the Mediterranean world. The fruit came from China. The route went through Sogdiana. The Sogdian script became the Uyghur script, became the Mongolian script, became the Manchu script, the writing system of the dynasty that ruled China until 1912. The peach and the apricot traveled with Sogdian caravans and are now native fruit in every garden in Europe. The commercial practices they invented became Islamic law, became the template for medieval European banking. A people who left no empire, no monuments, no surviving language, no living descendants who remember them, they are in the DNA of everything. The road ran on their operating system long after they were gone. It still does. The Sogdian colony at Afrasiab, near Samarkand, produced one of the most extraordinary surviving works of Silk Road art, a series of wall paintings from around 650 CE showing ambassadors from across the known world, Chinese, Indian, Korean, and others, arriving at the Sogdian court with gifts. The paintings were damaged when the palace was converted to other uses, but the surviving fragments show a cosmopolitan court culture that was simultaneously Zoroastrian in its religious imagery, Chinese in some of its artistic conventions, and uniquely Sogdian in its confident assertion that Samarkand was the center of the world. It was, in the 7th century, not an unreasonable claim. Source: Empires of the Silk Road, Christopher Beckwith, 2009. Chapter 4. 4. The religions that rode the road. How Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam traveled on the back of trade. The merchant who arrived first. The monks did not look like missionaries. They looked like merchants, road-worn, multilingual, comfortable in caravanserais, carrying scrolls alongside the trade goods that paid for the journey. This is how Buddhism reached China, not through organized conversion campaigns but through the movement of people who prayed in the same direction as the trade route pointed. The White Horse Temple that the Han Emperor Mingdi built in Luoyang in 68 CE, the story says he sent envoys west after dreaming of a golden figure, and the envoys came back with Indian monks on white horses, was not the first Buddhist presence in China. It was the moment the court noticed what the trade routes had already delivered. The date is almost certainly legendary and the story probably embellished. But the mechanism it describes is accurate. Buddhism came to China along the Silk Road, carried not primarily by missionaries but by merchants. The Indian and Central Asian traders who moved goods through the Kushan Empire, which occupied the territory of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan and whose rulers were among the most enthusiastic early patrons of Buddhism, brought their religion with them the way merchants have always brought their religion. As a portable identity, a network of shared obligation, a set of practices that could be performed at way stations and trading posts far from home. The pattern would repeat for every major religion that traveled the road. Buddhism moved east with Indian and Central Asian merchants. Nestorian Christianity moved east along the same routes with Syrian merchants. Manichaeism, the dualist religion founded by the Iranian prophet Mani in the 3rd century, spread in both directions along the road simultaneously. Islam moved east with Arab and Persian traders after the 7th century. What these religions had in common, what made them Silk Road religions rather than the place-bound cults they were replacing, was portability. They could be practiced anywhere. They required no sacrifices that depended on local geography, no temples tied to specific sacred sites, no priesthood that was attached to a particular land or clan. They traveled because they were designed, consciously or not, for people in motion. Buddhism's journey. The Buddhism that arrived in China along the Silk Road was not a single unified tradition but a collection of competing schools, texts, interpretations, and practices that had been developing in India for 5 centuries before the first monk crossed the Pamas. What the Chinese received was already a synthesis, Indian doctrines filtered through Central Asian translations, adapted to the commercial culture of the Kushan Empire, packaged in the form of sutras that could be copied, carried, and distributed along trade networks. The translation project that Chinese Buddhism undertook over the first 5 centuries of its presence in China was one of the great intellectual enterprises of the ancient world. Teams of scholars, Indian and Central Asian monks working alongside Chinese translators, spent their careers converting Sanskrit and Prakrit texts into Chinese, navigating the philosophical distance between languages that had evolved entirely separately and that had no shared vocabulary for the concepts they were trying to convey. The Chinese word for karma, the Sanskrit concept of moral causation that is central to Buddhist thought, was borrowed from Chinese Taoist vocabulary in a translation choice that shaped the way Buddhism would develop in China for the next 2,000 years. The Silk Road route by which Buddhism traveled to China is visible in the cave complexes that line the desert routes, Dunhuang, Kizil, Kumtura, thousands of caves carved into cliff faces and painted with Buddhist imagery by generations of donors who believed that sponsoring cave art was a meritorious act that would improve their karmic situation in the next life. The caves are a spiritual map of the trade routes. They cluster at the oasis towns where merchants stopped, where the money to sponsor them was available, where the monks who designed them were concentrated. Buddhism spread along the road because merchants paid for it. A case study, the Nestorian stele. In 1625, workers in the city of Alevanon, the former Han and Tang dynasty capital, unearthed a stone tablet 9 feet tall, covered in Chinese characters and a smaller portion of Syriac script. The inscription, dated to 781 CE, described the arrival of Christianity in China in 635 CE and the subsequent growth of a Nestorian Christian community in the Tang capital. It listed the names of Chinese and Syriac clergy, described Christian theology in Buddhist and Confucian vocabulary, and praised the Tang emperors for their tolerance of foreign religions. The stele, the Nestorian stele or monument of the propagation of the Luminous religion of Daqin in China, was the most startling evidence of the Silk Road's religious transmission to emerge in modern times, and its discovery generated a theological controversy that lasted for decades. Jesuit missionaries in China, who had spent a century trying to establish Christianity in a country that seemed to have no knowledge of it, were simultaneously delighted and troubled. Here was evidence that Christianity had reached China 1,000 years earlier, but the Christianity described on the stele was Nestorian, which Rome had declared heretical in 431 CE. The monk and the merchant needed each other more than either admitted. Religion traveled the road because trade made the road possible. Trade traveled the road partly because religion gave it meaning. The Nestorian Christianity that traveled the Silk Road was the Christianity of the Persian Empire and its successors, a theological tradition that had developed separately from the Roman Church after the Council of Ephesus and that had spread east through Persia, Central Asia, and China along the trading networks of Sogdian and Syrian merchants. At its height, the Nestorian Church had more adherents than the Roman Church. It stretched from Mesopotamia to China, with metropolitan sees in cities that most European Christians had never heard of. It was eventually destroyed, not by theological dispute but by the Mongol invasions and the subsequent spread of Islam, leaving behind only the stele and the occasional artifact, a cross here, a gravestone there, to tell the story of a Christianity that existed and flourished and died on the far side of the world from Rome. The road as sacred geography. The coincidence of trade routes and pilgrimage routes along the Silk Road was not accidental. The same infrastructure that made trade possible, the caravanserais, the water sources, the mountain passes, the systems of protection and hospitality made pilgrimage possible. And the merchants who traveled for commercial reasons and the monks who traveled for spiritual reasons were not distinct populations. Many traveled for both, supporting their spiritual journeys with trade goods and supporting their commercial activities with the merit-generating practices of religious devotion. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled from Chang'an to India between 629 and 645 CE to collect Buddhist scriptures, is the most famous pilgrim on the Silk Road. His journey became the basis for the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, in which he becomes the Tang monk accompanied by the Monkey King and a cast of supernatural helpers. What the novel obscures is the commercial context of his journey. Xuanzang traveled through a landscape dense with traders, through cities built on trade revenues, past cave complexes funded by merchant donations, relying on the hospitality networks that trade had created. His spiritual quest and the commercial world of the road were inseparable. The sacred geographies that the Silk Road religions created, the Buddhist cave complexes, the Nestorian churches, the Zoroastrian fire temples, the later Islamic shrines, were themselves waypoints in the commercial network, places where travelers could rest, pray, make donations, and have their passage facilitated by religious communities who had an interest in maintaining the road's traffic. Religion traveled the road because trade made the road possible. And trade traveled the road partly because religion gave it meaning, gave the merchants a framework for understanding their own mobility, a community of trust that extended beyond the family network, a set of practices that could be performed at the end of a terrifying desert crossing, and that religion traveled the road because trade made the road possible. Trade traveled the road partly because religion gave it meaning. The monk and the merchant needed each other more than either admitted. What the road did to the religions. The religions that traveled the Silk Road did not travel unchanged. Every tradition that moved along it was transformed by the contact with other traditions that the road made inevitable. The Buddhism that arrived in China was already a synthesis. The Buddhism that developed in China over the following centuries, Chan Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, the specific Chinese synthesis that eventually traveled to Japan and Korea and Vietnam, was something that Indian Buddhist teachers would not have recognized as their own. Manichaeism, the religion that spread most widely along the road, was itself a synthesis. It incorporated elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a dualist framework that was explicitly designed as a universal religion, able to present itself as the fulfillment of whatever tradition its audience already held. The Manichaean missionaries who traveled the road were the most self-conscious practitioners of religious syncretism in the ancient world, and their religion spread precisely because it was designed to be compatible with everything it encountered. The Nestorian Christianity that the stele describes, thriving in Tang China, stretching from Constantinople to the Pacific, was destroyed not by theological argument but by the Mongol invasions and the subsequent spread of a different religion along the same routes that had once carried it. The largest Christian community east of Constantinople, the one that had no connection to Rome and no knowledge of the debates that would eventually split the Western Church, simply ceased to exist. What remains is the stele in Lebanon, standing 9 feet tall in a museum built around it, recording in Chinese and Syriac the arrival of a god that the city no longer remembers. The road giveth and the road taketh away. The Xuanzang, who actually traveled to India between 629 and 645 CE, was a more ambiguous figure than the saintly monk of later legend. He left China without imperial permission, defying a travel ban that was in effect at the time. He survived the crossing of the Central Asian deserts partly through the assistance of Silk Road merchants who gave him provisions and guides. His account of his journey, the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, is one of the most valuable geographical and cultural documents of the 7th century, describing in precise detail the political situation, religious practices, and commercial activities of every city he passed through. He returned to Chang'an with 657 Sanskrit texts, 20 horses' worth of sacred objects, and enough material for a translation project that occupied the rest of his life. Source: Buddhism and the Silk Road, Susan Whitfield, 2004. Chapter 5. 5. The technologies that changed hands. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, and the debt the West owes the East. The Battle of Talas. The battle lasted one day. The Arab army under Ziyad ibn Soleh met the Tang Chinese force at the Talas River in 751 CE, routed them, and took prisoners. Among the prisoners, according to sources that historians treat with cautious respect, were Chinese craftsmen who knew how to make paper. They were taken to Samarkand. They taught what they knew. Within 50 years, paper mills were operating in Baghdad. Within a century, the House of Wisdom was copying the accumulated knowledge of the Greek world onto paper and extending it in directions the Greeks had not imagined. The battle that nobody remembers may have been the most consequential minor engagement in history. The Battle of Talas is a minor engagement in the history of Arab expansion and a footnote in the history of the Tang dynasty. It was fought over the control of trade routes in Central Asia, and its immediate political consequences were limited. The Chinese did not return, and the Arabs did not push further east. But if the story of the paper-making prisoners is accurate, the battle was one of the most consequential minor engagements in history, because the technology that those prisoners carried west with them eventually became the foundation of the Islamic Golden Age, the European Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. Paper is the medium through which all recorded human thought has traveled for the past 13 centuries. Its journey from China to the world is the Silk Road's most important technological transfer. The Chinese had been making paper from mulberry bark and hemp and bamboo since at least the 2nd century CE. They had been keeping the method secret for roughly the same period. The secret held for 500 years in the West, longer than the silk secret, though the two were transmitted along similar routes by similar mechanisms. What carried paper west was not industrial espionage, exactly, but the same combination of military capture, commercial contact, and incremental knowledge transfer that carried most technologies along the road. The prisoners of Talas were one episode in a longer process. 4 technologies and what they did. The paper that moved west from China transformed the Islamic world within a century of Talas. Baghdad, founded as the Abbasid capital in 762 CE, had developed a major paper industry by 800 CE. The House of Wisdom, the great translation and research institution established by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and expanded by his successor al-Mamun, used paper to preserve and extend the Greek scientific and philosophical tradition, copying Aristotle and Euclid and Ptolemy onto paper and adding Arabic commentary that developed the originals in ways the Greeks had not imagined. When this accumulated knowledge eventually traveled from the Islamic world to medieval Europe, it traveled on paper, and it transformed European intellectual life in ways that would not have been possible with the fragile, expensive, difficult-to-produce parchment that European scribes had been using. Gunpowder followed a longer and more circuitous route. The Chinese Taoist alchemists who first synthesized it in the 9th century were looking for an elixir of immortality. What they found was a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that burned with explosive force. The Chinese military used it for centuries in fireworks, fire arrows, and proto-grenades before developing firearms. The technology reached the Islamic world through the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and from the Islamic world reached Europe, where it was developed into the cannon and the musket that would eventually end the era of castle walls and armored knights and reshape the political geography of the world. The compass, whose invention the Chinese attribute to the Han dynasty, was in practical use by Chinese navigators by the 11th century. It reached the Islamic world in the 12th century and Europe in the 13th, arriving at the precise moment when European sailors were beginning to imagine voyages beyond the Mediterranean and the coastal waters of northern Europe. Without the compass, Columbus's crossing of the Atlantic was not impossible but was dramatically harder. The dead reckoning navigation that sailors had used since antiquity could not sustain a crossing of 3,000 miles of featureless ocean. The compass is the technology that made the Age of Discovery possible, which means it is the technology that ended the Silk Road era by making the sea routes viable. A case study: the House of Wisdom. Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was established in Baghdad in the early 9th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun, though it drew on an institution that his father Harun al-Rashid had begun. Its core project was translation, converting the scientific and philosophical texts of the Greek world, along with Persian, Indian, and Syriac sources, into Arabic. The translators who worked there were multilingual scholars from across the empire, Christian scholars from Syria, Jewish scholars from Persia, converts from every intellectual tradition the Islamic conquests had absorbed, working at the intersection of languages and traditions that the Silk Road had brought into contact. What the House of Wisdom produced was not simply translations but synthesis. The Arabic mathematicians who worked with Indian and Greek mathematical traditions simultaneously did not just copy, they combined. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the early 9th century, drew on Indian positional notation and Greek geometric algebra to create a new discipline that he called al-Jabr, algebra. The word, and the discipline, traveled west to Europe in the 12th century through the Arabic to Latin translations of Toledo and Palermo, arriving in Europe as algebra, carrying the name of the operation al-Jabr, the setting of broken bones, the restoration of what is missing, that had given it its first systematic description. The alchemists looking for immortality found gunpowder. Nobody invents what history needs. History takes what is invented and decides what it needs. The House of Wisdom was destroyed by the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, when Hulagu Khan's forces threw its library into the Tigris River. So many books, the sources say, that the river ran black with ink. The story may be somewhat exaggerated but is not invented. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad was genuine and comprehensive. What survived did so because it had already been copied, distributed, translated, because the paper technology that made the House of Wisdom possible also made its knowledge mobile. The library was destroyed. The knowledge was not, because knowledge on paper can be copied, and paper had been moving west along the Silk Road for 4 centuries. The technologies that moved east. The transfer of technology along the Silk Road was not unidirectional. While China was sending paper and gunpowder and the compass westward, the Islamic world and the Mediterranean world were sending technologies eastward that transformed Chinese material culture in ways that Chinese sources rarely acknowledge with the same emphasis they give to westward transfers. Glassblowing, the technology that allowed the production of transparent glass vessels, was a Roman invention of the 1st century BCE that spread east along the trade routes and reached China by the 4th century CE. The Chinese had been producing glass before this, but the Roman technique inflating molten glass with a blowpipe to create thin-walled, transparent vessels was a qualitative improvement that the Chinese could not replicate independently and did not until they received it from the West. The glass vessels that Chinese archaeologists find in Tang dynasty tombs were not imports, they were Chinese products made using Western techniques. The horse collar, which allowed draft horses to pull without choking themselves and effectively tripled the agricultural productivity of horse-powered farming, moved from Central Asia to China and eventually to Europe in the early medieval period. The cotton that became the basic fabric of the modern world was an Indian crop that spread west along the trade routes. The sugar cane that would eventually reshape the Atlantic economy was a Southeast Asian plant that traveled through India to the Islamic world to the Mediterranean and eventually to the Americas. The Silk Road was a circulatory system for the material culture of the ancient world, and the direction of circulation was not fixed. The debt and its denial. The technologies that Europe received from Asia along the Silk Road, directly or through the Islamic intermediary, are the foundation of European modernity in a way that European historical narratives have consistently underemphasized. Paper enabled the printing press. The printing press enabled the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. Gunpowder ended feudalism by making castle walls obsolete and creating the mass armies that only centralized states could afford to maintain. The compass made the sea routes possible, which made the Atlantic slave trade and the colonization of the Americas possible, which made the modern global economy possible. None of these consequences were intended by the Chinese or Indian or Islamic scientists and craftsmen who developed the original technologies. The alchemists who found gunpowder were looking for immortality. The Chinese navigators who developed the compass were trying to find their way around the South China Sea. The papermakers of Han Dynasty China were trying to find a cheaper alternative to bamboo tablets. The specific historical consequences of their inventions were produced by the Silk Road, by the mechanism of transfer that took what existed in one civilization and delivered it to another civilization. The alchemists looking for immortality found gunpowder. The navigators finding their way around a coast invented the compass. The papermakers saving money on bamboo created the printing press. Nobody invents what history needs. History takes what is invented and decides what it needs. The debt that Western modernity owes to the technologies of the East is real and largely unacknowledged in the popular history of progress, which tends to run from Greece to Rome to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution in a narrative that keeps the action firmly in Europe. The civilization that invented paper used it for bureaucracy. The civilization that received it used it for the Renaissance. The civilization that invented gunpowder used it for fireworks. The civilization that received it used it to end the age of castle walls and armored knights. The compass that Chinese navigators built to find their way around the South China Sea ended up in the hands of Portuguese sailors, who used it to find a route that made the Silk Road obsolete. The road that transmitted the technologies that killed it did not survive long enough to understand the irony. But the irony is there, built into the structure of every transfer the road ever made. Al-Khwarizmi's name is the source of the English word algorithm. The word derives from the Latinization of his name algorithmi, which appeared in the 12th century Latin translation of his work on Indian numeral calculation. The combination of his name as a word for computational procedure and his discipline's name as algebra means that Al-Khwarizmi has given English two of its most important mathematical terms. He worked in Baghdad at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, drawing on Greek, Indian, and Persian mathematical traditions simultaneously. He is the direct intellectual ancestor of every computer program ever written. Source: The House of Wisdom, Jonathan Lyons, 2009. Chapter 6. 6. The Plagues that Traveled with the Goods. How the Silk Road Spread the Justinian Plague, the Black Death, and the Logic of Pandemic. The Other Cargo. The rat boarded the ship in Kaffa. The ship sailed for Constantinople. The rat was dead before it arrived, but the fleas that had been living on the rat were not, and when they lost their host they found new ones among the sailors, and the sailors began to die, and the ship arrived in Constantinople harbor in 541 CE with half its crew dead and the other half dying, and what came off that ship was not silk or spice or glass. It was the Justinianic plague, the first great pandemic of the Christian era, carried west along the same routes as everything else the Silk Road moved, because the road did not distinguish between cargo worth carrying and cargo worth stopping. The Justinianic plague, which erupted in Constantinople in 541 CE and killed perhaps 50 million people over the following 2 centuries, traveled the same routes as the silk and the spices and the ideas that made the Silk Road famous. Its origin was in the rodent populations of Central Asia, the same ecological reservoir that would produce the Black Death 8 centuries later. Its western journey followed the commercial routes through Persia and the Byzantine Empire that Silk Road merchants had been using for centuries. The plague did not travel because anyone chose to carry it. It traveled because the infrastructure that made the ancient world's greatest commercial network possible also made it the ancient world's greatest disease vector. The connection between trade and epidemic disease is not a coincidence or an irony. It is a structural feature of any system that moves people and goods across large distances. The more efficiently a trade network functions, the more rapidly it moves goods, the more densely it connects distant places, the more thoroughly it integrates separated populations, the more efficiently it moves pathogens. The Silk Road was, among other things, the most sophisticated disease transmission system that the ancient world had yet produced. The Justinianic plague and what it destroyed. The Justinian plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 541 CE from Egypt, carried along the grain routes that supplied the Byzantine capital. The historian Procopius, who was in the city when it arrived, described the symptoms with clinical precision: the swellings in the groin and armpit, the delirium, the death sometimes within hours of the first symptoms, sometimes after days of fever. At the plague's height, he wrote, 5,000 people were dying in Constantinople every day. The Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived, one of the lucky minority who recovered from bubonic infection. His empire did not recover, not in the sense that mattered. The Justinianic plague killed perhaps a quarter of the eastern Mediterranean population in its first wave, and it returned in repeated outbreaks for the next 2 centuries, killing each new generation that had not been exposed to the first wave and therefore had no immunity. The military, administrative, and agricultural workforce that Justinian had been relying on for his ambitious projects, the reconquest of the Western Empire, the codification of Roman law, the construction of the Hagia Sophia, was decimated in ways that his treasury and his recruiting officers could not compensate for. The plague's specific historical contribution was to end the last credible attempt to reunite the Roman Empire. Justinian had come closer than any emperor since the 3rd century to restoring Roman control over the western Mediterranean. When the plague arrived, his armies were advancing in Italy and Spain, his generals were winning battles they should not have been able to win, the momentum of reconquest was real. The plague stopped that momentum and reversed it, not immediately, but definitively. The Italy that emerged from the decades of Justinianic warfare and plague was not a restored Roman province. It was a fragmented, depopulated, economically diminished place that would not see anything like urban prosperity again for 5 centuries. A case study: the plague road from Kyrgyzstan to Kaffa. The story of the Black Death's origin begins not in 1347 at the port of Kaffa but in the graveyards near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, where tombstones from 1338 and 1339 record deaths from pestilence in numbers far exceeding normal mortality. These graves belong to Nestorian Christian merchants, the same community that had carried Christianity east along the Silk Road centuries earlier, who were dying of something catastrophic along the trade routes of Central Asia years before the plague reached Europe. The route from those Central Asian graves to the walls of Kaffa followed the western branch of the Silk Road, from Kyrgyzstan through the trading cities of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the steppe routes north of the Caspian and Black Seas. The plague moved with the trade, through cities where goods changed hands and merchants rested and rats fed on grain stores and fleas moved between hosts. It arrived at Kaffa, the Genos trading colony on the Crimean coast, in 1346, carried in the army of Janibeg Khan that was besieging the city, and from Kaffa it traveled to the Mediterranean on Genos ships whose crews were dead or dying at their oars. A world connected enough to trade is a world connected enough to suffer the consequences of connection. The road that the ancient world built to move silk moved everything else with equal efficiency. The specific route of the Black Death's westward journey is the route of the Silk Road's western terminus, and this is not a coincidence. The plague traveled west because the road traveled west. The infrastructure that Sogdian merchants had built over 5 centuries, the caravanserais, the trading colonies, the credit networks, the diplomatic relationships that made long-distance movement possible, was the infrastructure that the plague used. The road that had carried silk and paper and religion and mathematics from China to Europe carried the worst epidemic in human history along the same routes, at the same speeds, through the same cities. The epidemiology of trade. Every major Silk Road pandemic followed the same basic pattern: origin in the Central Asian rodent reservoir, transmission to human populations at trading nodes, westward movement along commercial routes, amplification in the densely populated cities of the Byzantine or Islamic or European world. The pattern repeated because the road repeated, because the same infrastructure existed, the same rat populations inhabited the same grain stores, the same fleas found the same hosts, the same movement of goods provided the same opportunity for pathogen transmission. The relationship between trade and epidemic disease became the driver of the first public health institutions in European history. The quarantine systems that Venice developed in the 14th century, the 40-day isolation of arriving ships, the inspection of cargo, the Lazaretto Islands where the sick were held, were explicitly designed to interrupt the connection between trade and disease. They were designed by governments that had watched the plague arrive on trading ships and concluded that the only way to prevent future arrivals was to slow down the movement that the ships represented. The quarantine was, in a small but real sense, the first attempt to control the Silk Road, to impose on the movement of goods and people the kind of inspection and delay that could separate the commercially valuable cargo from the biologically dangerous one. It did not work perfectly, and it imposed enormous costs on the merchants whose ships sat in harbor for 40 days while their perishable goods spoiled. But it worked well enough to slow subsequent plagues, and it established the principle that the state had a responsibility to manage the interface between commerce and public health, that even the quarantine worked well enough to slow the plague. It did not work well enough to stop it. Nothing did, until the bacterium ran out of new populations to infect. What the road taught us about disease. The Silk Road's epidemiological legacy is as important as its commercial legacy, and considerably less celebrated. Every major pandemic of the pre-modern period, the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, the Justinianic Plague, the Black Death, and the subsequent recurrences of plague through the 17th century, traveled along trade routes. The correlation between the expansion of trade networks and the expansion of epidemic disease is not coincidental. It is the mechanism by which diseases that were previously confined to specific ecological niches were introduced to populations that had no immunity. The same mechanism operates today. COVID-19 traveled from a city in China to every country on Earth in a matter of weeks because the world has a trade and travel infrastructure that would make a Sogdian merchant dizzy with astonishment. Daily flights between every major city, container ships carrying millions of tons of goods across every ocean, supply chains that connect the factory floor in Guangdong to the retail shelf in Ohio in a matter of days. The specific pathogen was different. The mechanism was the same as it was in 541 CE. A disease that existed in an animal reservoir found its way into the movement infrastructure of a connected world and was distributed to every node in the network before anyone understood what was happening. COVID-19 traveled from Wuhan to every country on Earth in 6 weeks, carried on the same infrastructure, the flights, the shipping containers, the supply chains, that carries everything else the modern world trades. The specific pathogen was novel. The mechanism was as old as the Silk Road. The Sogdian merchant who loaded his camels in Dunhuang in 541 CE and the traveler who boarded a flight in Wuhan in December 2019 were unknowing participants in the same system. A world connected enough to trade is a world connected enough to suffer the consequences of connection. The road that the ancient world built to move silk moved everything else with equal efficiency. It still does. The Justinianic Plague and the Black Death were caused by the same pathogen, Yersinia pestis, as modern genetic analysis of ancient DNA from plague burials has confirmed. The strains that caused the two pandemics were related but distinct, suggesting that the bacterium underwent significant evolution between the 6th and 14th centuries, probably in the Central Asian rodent reservoir where it persisted between outbreaks. The specific strain that caused the Black Death was apparently more virulent than its Justinianic ancestor. The Black Death killed a higher proportion of the people it infected, which may explain why the later epidemic was so much more devastating despite striking a population that had some ancestral exposure to the earlier one. Source: Plagues and Peoples, William McNeill, 1976. Chapter 7. 7. The Languages That Merged. How Trade Created Scripts, Alphabets, and the Numbers We Use Today. The Market That Needed a Language. Somewhere on the road between Samarkand and Chang'an, a Phoenician alphabet became a Sogdian alphabet, became a Uyghur alphabet, became a Mongolian alphabet, became the writing system of the dynasty that ruled China until 1912. The chain of transmission took 1800 years. It passed through a dozen languages that no longer have living speakers. It ran along trade routes that no longer exist. And it deposited, at the end of this improbable journey, a script that Mongolian schoolchildren still learn today, descended, through a series of adaptations so gradual that no single step looks significant, from marks carved on clay in Phoenicia 3,000 years before Genghis Khan was born. The improvisation that multilingual trade requires produces, over generations, something more systematic than gestures and approximations. It produces pidgin languages, simplified, grammatically reduced contact varieties that allow speakers of different first languages to communicate about the specific topics that trade requires. It produces trade languages, languages that become so widely useful as commercial media that merchants learn them as second languages specifically to facilitate exchange. It produces writing systems that are designed to be learned quickly by people with different native scripts. The Silk Road was the greatest linguistic laboratory in the history of the ancient world, and the languages it produced and the scripts it transmitted are still in use today. The most consequential linguistic transmission of the Silk Road was not a language but an alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, which developed on the eastern Mediterranean coast in the 2nd millennium BCE, was a system of consonant signs with no vowel markers efficient for Semitic languages, in which the consonantal root carries most of the meaning, but awkward for other language families. As it traveled east along the trade routes, it was adapted and modified by each language community that adopted it. The Aramaic script that descended from Phoenician became the ancestor, through a chain of adaptations, of the Arabic script, the Hebrew script, the Syriac script, the Sogdian script, the Uyghur script, the Mongolian script, and dozens of other writing systems. One alphabet, traveling east along the road, became the writing systems of half the world. The numbers. The most consequential thing that traveled along the Silk Road, the one thing without which modern science, engineering, commerce, and computing would be impossible, was not silk or paper or gunpowder. It was a way of writing numbers. The positional decimal notation system that we call Arabic numerals was developed in India, probably sometime around the 5th century CE. Its crucial innovation was the zero, a symbol that indicated the absence of a quantity and that allowed the position of a digit to determine its value. With positional notation, the same 9 symbols could represent any number at all. There was no need for the cumbersome additive systems of Roman numerals or the specialized symbols of Greek mathematical notation. Calculation became not just possible but fast, scalable, and teachable to people without years of specialized mathematical training. The Indian numerical system traveled west along the Silk Road in the 7th and 8th centuries, reaching Baghdad at the moment when the House of Wisdom was at the height of its intellectual activity. Al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician whose name became algorithm, wrote a treatise in the 820s specifically explaining the Indian numerical system to an Arabic-speaking audience. His treatise was translated into Latin in the 12th century. The translation began with the words Dixit algorithmi, algorithmi said, meaning Al-Khwarizmi said, and the numerals he described gradually replaced Roman numerals in European calculation over the following 3 centuries. By the Renaissance, Arabic numerals were the universal medium of European commerce and science. By the 20th century, they were the universal medium of all human numerical expression. The Silk Road moved a way of thinking about quantity from India to the world. A case study, the Uyghur script and its children. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in the early 13th century and began constructing the largest contiguous empire in history, he had a practical problem. The Mongols had no writing system. The Silk Road had many, and the most readily available at the moment of Mongol expansion was the Uyghur script, the writing system of the Uyghur traders and administrators who served the early Mongol state as scribes, interpreters, and bureaucrats. The Uyghur script was itself a descendant of the Sogdian script, which was descended from the Aramaic script, which was descended from the Phoenician alphabet. In adopting it, the Mongols were taking on a writing system that carried within it thousands of years of transmission and adaptation along the Silk Road. The Mongolian script that developed from the Uyghur model turned 90 degrees to run vertically on the page, in a uniquely Mongolian adaptation, became the medium of Mongol imperial administration and eventually the ancestor of the Manchu script that the Qing dynasty used to govern China until 1912. Algebra, algorithm, cipher, zero. The words are a fossil record of the transmission, showing, with linguistic precision, when and from where European civilization received the tools that allowed it to outcompete the civilizations that invented them. The Uyghur script also traveled south. When the founders of the Mughal Empire, itself of Mongol descent, conquered northern India in the 16th century, they brought with them a scriptural tradition that included Uyghur-derived elements. The Persian script that dominated Mughal court culture was itself descended from Arabic, which was descended from Aramaic, which was descended from Phoenician. The scripts of four of the world's largest religions, Arabic for Islam, Hebrew for Judaism, Greek for Christianity, Devanagari for Hinduism, all descend from a single Phoenician ancestor whose innovations traveled east along the trade routes of the ancient Mediterranean. The Silk Road did not create this family of scripts, but it carried the intermediate forms from one civilization to the next and made the connections that turned a regional innovation into a global standard. Trade languages and what they reveal. The trade languages of the Silk Road reveal, in their vocabulary, the specific history of what moved along the route. Persian, Farsi, became the lingua franca of the medieval Silk Road from Persia to northern India, a language that merchants from different native language backgrounds could use as a common medium. Its trade vocabulary includes words borrowed from Arabic and Sogdian and Turkic and Sanskrit, each borrowing marking a specific commercial or cultural contact. The word for market, bazaar, is Persian. It entered Turkish and Hindi and through them dozens of other languages, wherever the Persian-mediated trade culture reached. The specific words that languages borrow reveal the specific things they received from the cultures they contacted. English borrowed sugar from the Arabic sukkar, which borrowed it from the Sanskrit shakara, which was the word for the sweet crystalline substance produced from sugarcane, a plant that originated in Southeast Asia and traveled west through India and the Islamic world to the Mediterranean and eventually to the Americas. Every time an English speaker uses the word sugar, they are tracing, in a single syllable, the entire westward journey of a plant along the trade routes of the ancient world. The vocabulary of mathematics in European languages is Arabic in origin because European mathematical learning came from Arabic sources along the Silk Road intermediary. Algebra, algorithm, cipher, zero, the technical vocabulary of the discipline that underlies all modern science and technology was borrowed from Arabic in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the Latin translations of Arabic mathematical texts reached European universities. The words are a fossil record of the transmission. They show, with linguistic precision, when and from where European civilization received the intellectual tools to teach algebra. Algorithm. Cipher. Zero. The words are a fossil record of the transmission, showing, with linguistic precision, when and from where European civilization received the tools that allowed it to outcompete the civilizations that invented them. The civilizations that invented the tools did not get to keep the advantage. The language the road spoke. The Silk Road did not have a single language, but it had something that functioned like one, the accumulated bilingualism of the communities that lived along it. The merchant families who settled in trading colonies at key nodes on the road were, by necessity, multilingual, fluent in the local language for daily transactions, in the language of their home community for family business, and in whatever trade language served as the regional medium. Their children were often trilingual from birth, and their professional competence required them to add languages as they expanded their networks. This accumulated multilingualism was itself a technology, a form of human capital that was as valuable as the goods being traded and that was, in some respects, more durable. Languages outlast the empires that create them. Persian survived the Arab conquest of Persia to become the administrative language of the Islamic world east of Baghdad. Sogdian survived the Arab conquest of Sogdiana for several centuries before finally giving way. The Silk Road languages persisted as long as the trade persisted, because the trade required them. What the road's linguistic history reveals, ultimately, is that language is a technology like any other, that it can be invented, improved, borrowed, adapted, and transmitted along commercial networks, and that the specific languages that survive are the ones that were most useful at the nodes of the network where most of the exchange happened. The word sugar entered English from Arabic sukkar, which took it from Sanskrit shakara, which described a crystalline substance from a plant that originated in Southeast Asia. Every time you use the word, you are tracing the entire westward journey of that plant, from Southeast Asian jungle to Indian farm to Persian market to Arab trader to English tongue, in a single syllable. The road is in the language. The language is in the road. The trade is over but the words remain, carrying the root inside them like a fossil carries the shape of the creature it replaced. The word chess enters English through Persian shatranj, which entered Persian from Sanskrit shatranga, which means 4 divisions, referring to the 4 divisions of the ancient Indian army: infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, which became the pawn, knight, bishop, and rook of the modern game. Chess itself was probably invented in India in the 6th century CE and traveled west along the Silk Road to Persia and from Persia to the Islamic world and from the Islamic world to medieval Europe, arriving in each culture as a gift from the culture immediately to the east. Its terminology traveled with it, carrying in the names of the pieces the history of the route by which the game had come. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 8. 8. The Money That Moved. Credit, Letters of Exchange, and the First International Financial System. The problem with carrying coins. Tang Dynasty China called it feiqian, flying money. A merchant deposited his silver with a government office in one city and received a certificate. He rode 4,000 miles to the capital and exchanged the certificate for silver at the central treasury. The silver had not moved. Only the information had moved. The insight embedded in that transaction, that money is information, that value can travel faster than metal, was one of the most consequential ideas in economic history. And it traveled the Silk Road in both directions for 1,000 years before European bankers rediscovered it and called it a bill of exchange and built the Renaissance on the proceeds. The financial instruments that Silk Road merchants developed to solve this problem were the ancestors of modern banking. The letter of credit, a document that allowed a merchant to deposit funds with a banker in one city and withdraw an equivalent amount from a partner institution in another city, appears in Silk Road documentation by at least the 8th century CE. The hundis of Indian merchants, the suftajas of Islamic merchants, and the feiqian, flying money of Tang Dynasty China were all variants of the same basic instrument, a way of moving the hundis of Indian merchants, the suftajas of Islamic merchants, the feiqian of Tang China, different names, different legal frameworks, the same insight. Money is a promise. A promise can travel without weight. The flying money system developed in Tang China was particularly sophisticated. Merchants depositing tax revenues or trade profits with regional government offices received certificates that they could redeem at the central treasury in Chang'an. The system was designed to reduce the risk and cost of transporting coins across the empire, and it worked well enough to persist in modified form for centuries. It was not a bank in the modern sense, it did not create money through lending, but it was the first large-scale implementation of the principle that money's value could be separated from the physical object that represented it. The Islamic Financial Revolution. The Islamic financial system that developed between the 8th and 12th centuries was the most sophisticated commercial infrastructure the world had yet seen, and it was built specifically to support long-distance trade along the Silk Road routes. Islamic law prohibited riba, interest on loans, which created a challenge for merchants who needed to finance trading expeditions that might take years to return a profit. The creative response to this prohibition produced a set of financial instruments that were, in their basic structure, surprisingly similar to the instruments that modern Islamic finance uses today. The Mudaraba partnership was the most important of these instruments for Silk Road trade. In a Mudaraba arrangement, one party, the capital provider, supplied the funds for a trading expedition, while the other party, the traveling merchant, supplied the labor and expertise. Profits were split according to a pre-agreed formula, losses fell entirely on the capital provider. The arrangement allowed wealthy individuals who could not make the journey themselves to participate in the profits of the trade, while providing traveling merchants with capital they could not have assembled independently. It was, in effect, a form of venture capital, Islamic law compliant and optimized for the specific risk structure of long-distance caravan trade. The bills of exchange that Islamic merchants developed for use across the vast geography of the Abbasid Caliphate and its trading partners were similarly sophisticated. A merchant in Baghdad could issue a written order directing a banking correspondent in Cairo or Samarkand to pay a specified sum to a named third party. The bill traveled faster than the goods it financed and arrived before the merchandise, which meant that buyers could arrange payment before the goods arrived and sellers could finance new purchases with the proceeds of sales not yet completed. The velocity of money in the Islamic trading world was, by the standards of any pre-modern economy, remarkable. A case study: the Cairo Janaza. In 1896, Solomon Schechter, a Cambridge scholar of rabbinics, climbed into a storage room above a medieval synagogue in Cairo, the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, the oldest part of the Egyptian capital, and found himself looking at a room packed with papers. Jews do not destroy documents that contain the name of God, and the medieval community of Fustat had been depositing its used papers in this room for centuries. There were approximately 300,000 documents, letters, contracts, court records, poems, marriage agreements, divorce settlements, lists of goods, accounts of debts, medical prescriptions, children's writing exercises, and the accumulated paper of a Jewish mercantile community that had been conducting international trade from Cairo since the 10th century. The Cairo Janaza documents are the most important archive of medieval commercial life that exists. They reveal, in the specific detail of individual transactions, the operation of a Jewish-Arabic merchant network that connected Egypt to India through the trade routes of the Indian Ocean and to the Mediterranean through the routes of the Silk Road. The merchants whose letters survive were buying and selling pepper and flax and dye and metal goods and textiles across distances of thousands of miles, using financial instruments, letters of credit, partnership agreements, bills of exchange that are recognizable to any modern banker. Money is a promise. A promise can travel without weight. The Tang dynasty merchants figured out the concept 1200 years before anyone called it a cryptocurrency. What the Janaza reveals most vividly is the human texture of long-distance trade, the anxiety of waiting for ships that are overdue, the frustration of partners who have not remitted promised funds, the complex negotiations over prices in markets where you are dependent on an agent whose interests do not perfectly align with your own. The merchants whose letters survive were not abstractions or representatives of commercial systems. They were individuals with families and debts and opinions about specific business partners, operating in a world where a single shipwreck could wipe out years of accumulated profit and where the difference between a good season and a bad one was often a matter of whether you had received timely information about market conditions in a city 3 weeks away by sea. The credit that built the road. The financial infrastructure of the Silk Road was, ultimately, a system for managing trust across distance. Every instrument it developed, the letter of credit, the bill of exchange, the partnership agreement, The deposit bank was a technology for extending the radius within which two parties who did not know each other personally could nevertheless conduct business with confidence. The specific mechanisms varied. The Islamic world used different instruments than the Chinese world, which used different instruments than the Indian world. But the underlying problem was the same everywhere the road reached. How do you do business with someone you have never met, who lives 4,000 miles away, whose legal system you do not understand, and whom you may never meet? The answer was the same everywhere: institutional intermediaries. The banking family, the merchant guild, the religious community, the ethnic trading network, all of these were institutions that could guarantee the behavior of their members because they had ongoing relationships with them, reputational stakes in their performance, and mechanisms for enforcing obligations that transcended any individual transaction. The Silk Road's financial infrastructure was a network of such institutions, overlapping and competing and occasionally collaborating, covering the route from Chang'an to Constantinople with a web of commercial trust that made the movement of goods possible. The European financial revolution of the 13th and 14th centuries, the development of double-entry bookkeeping, the bill of exchange, the deposit bank, the joint stock company, drew directly on Islamic models that had themselves drawn on earlier Silk Road models. The Medici Bank, which financed the Renaissance, operated on instruments and principles that had been traveling west along the road for 5 centuries before Lorenzo de' Medici was born. The road that moved silk and paper and gunpowder also moved the financial architecture of the modern world, in forms so thoroughly naturalized into European commercial practice that their Asian origins became invisible. Money as information. The deepest insight that the Silk Road's financial history offers is about the nature of money itself. The flying money of Tang China, the suftaja of Islamic merchants, the bill of exchange of medieval Europe, all of these instruments were recognitions that money is, at its core, information, a claim about value that can be transmitted, recorded, and honored by parties who have never exchanged physical currency. The step from a letter of credit to a banknote is a small one in conceptual terms, though it took several centuries to complete in practice. Once you accept that a piece of paper representing a claim on value is as good as the metal that backs the claim, once you accept that the information is the money, the entire architecture of modern finance becomes conceivable. Central banks, fractional reserve banking, electronic money transfers, cryptocurrency. All of these are extensions of the insight that the Silk Road merchants were implementing, imperfectly and empirically, in their letters of credit and flying money certificates. The Medici Bank that financed the Renaissance operated on instruments that had been traveling west along the Silk Road for 5 centuries before Lorenzo de' Medici was born. The bill of exchange, the letter of credit, the partnership agreement that split risk between capital and labor, all of it came from the Islamic financial revolution that came from the Silk Road merchants who came from the problem of moving value 4,000 miles without being robbed. The road ended. The instruments it invented became the architecture of the modern economy. The cryptocurrency that its advocates describe as a revolutionary new form of money, trustless, borderless, separated from any physical backing, is the Feiqian with better software. The Tang dynasty merchants figured out the concept 1200 years ago. The Cairo Geniza documents were eventually distributed to libraries across the world after Schechter brought the bulk of them to Cambridge. The largest collection is at Cambridge University Library. Significant collections are at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and the Alliance Israelite Universal in Paris. The digitization project that has been making them available online since the early 2000s has allowed scholars to read the accumulated business correspondence of a medieval Jewish merchant community in Cairo with a completeness and detail that no previous generation of historians could access. The merchants who wrote those letters never imagined that their anxious inquiries about overdue shipments would be read by scholars in the 21st century. They were just trying to run their businesses. Source: A Mediterranean Society, SD Goetin, 1967. Chapter 9. 9. The Empires That Needed It. How Han China, Rome, Byzantium, and the Abbasids turned trade into power. The tax collector at the gate. Every empire that touched the Silk Road understood the same thing. The man who sits at the gate of a trade route does not need to carry goods himself. He just needs to be at the gate. The Han Dynasty garrison at Dunhuang, the Roman customs post at Palmyra, the Byzantine toll house at the Bosphorus crossing, the Abbasid inspectors at the Persian Gulf ports, all of them were expressions of the same imperial insight, that controlling the point of passage was more profitable than doing the trading. Let the Sogdians take the risks. Let the camels die in the desert. Collect 10% of everything that passes through your territory and let others do the work of moving it. The revenue that the Silk Road generated for the empires along its route was not its only value, and arguably not its primary one. Information traveled faster than goods. An empire with customs posts and garrison towns along a trade route received, with every passing caravan, intelligence about the political situation in the civilizations at the other end, troop movements, succession disputes, harvest failures, new alliances. The Han Emperor, who knew about Roman political instability before Roman merchants arrived to sell glass, was an emperor with a negotiating advantage. The Byzantine court that knew about Sassanid Persian military preparations before the Persian ambassador arrived was a court that could calibrate its response. The Silk Road was the intelligence network of the ancient world, and every empire that sat on it understood this. What made the Silk Road essential to empire, what made the empires fight to control it and scheme to maintain access to it, was not the luxury goods that flow through diplomatic exchanges, though those mattered. It was the combination of revenue, intelligence, and the kind of soft power that comes from being the civilization that other civilizations want access to. The Han Dynasty's decision to project military force into Central Asia in the 2nd century BCE, fighting a series of expensive campaigns against the Xiongnu nomads who threatened the trade routes, was not a decision made because Chinese emperors wanted Roman glass and Byzantine silk. It was a decision made because control of the road was control of a system, and the system was worth fighting for. Rome's silk problem. Rome had a balance of payments crisis caused by silk. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, estimated that Rome was sending 50 million sesterces per year to the east, to India, Arabia, and China, to pay for luxury goods, primarily silk, spices, and precious stones. He was horrified, all that wealth flowing out of the empire to barbarians, in exchange for fabric and flavoring. The Roman Senate passed sumptuary legislation restricting the wearing of silk by men. It was ignored. The silk kept flowing west. The money kept flowing east. The specific mechanism of Rome's silk trade reveals the political structure of the ancient world. Rome did not buy silk directly from China. It bought it from Parthian and later Sassanid Persian merchants who controlled the overland routes and who extracted whatever markup the traffic would bear. Roman attempts to find an alternative route, trading directly with India by sea, establishing diplomatic contact with Chinese courts that bypassed the Persian intermediary, were partially successful but never eliminated the Persian advantage. The Parthians and Sassanids understood what they had, which was a geographic monopoly on the most valuable trade route in the world, and they defended it with the same ferocity that China defended its silk monopoly. The diplomatic correspondence between Rome and China, largely conducted through intermediaries who translated for each side and almost certainly introduced their own interests into the translations, reveals two empires that were aware of each other's existence, that had inflated and largely inaccurate ideas about each other's wealth and power, and that never managed to establish direct contact that cut out the middlemen. The middlemen, who had every incentive to prevent such contact, were very good at their jobs. The Silk Road's intermediaries were not passive conduits. They were active managers of the information that flowed through them, and they managed it in their own interests. A case study, Palmyra and the desert toll. Palmyra rose in the Syrian desert because the desert required it. The city sat at the junction of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, the point where caravans from the east, laden with silk and spice and incense, made their last desert crossing before reaching the Roman world. Every caravan stopped there. Every caravan paid. The city that grew up around this toll booth became, in the first 3 centuries CE, one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan cities in the Roman Empire, a place where Greek and Aramaic and Palmyrene were spoken simultaneously, where Roman architecture dressed itself in Eastern ornament, where the merchant families that ran the trade grew wealthy enough to commission temple complexes that still stand in the Syrian desert 2,000 years later. The Palmyrene merchants who escorted caravans across the Syrian desert were not mere toll-keepers. They were protection providers, financiers, translators, and intelligence brokers. A caravan that hired a Palmyrene escort got more than armed guards. It got access to the network of contacts, the knowledge of desert water sources, the diplomatic relationships with nomadic tribes, and the commercial expertise that allowed goods to move from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean with a minimum of the violence and extortion that the unescorted journey invited. The Palmyrenes charged for these services, but they delivered real value, which is why merchants paid willingly. The road was not just a conduit for physical goods. It was a network through which information moved. And the empire that sat at the gate collected everything: revenue, intelligence, and the soft power of being the civilization others needed access to. Palmyra's power ended when Queen Zenobia, ruling as regent for her young son in the 260s CE, decided that the city's economic position entitled it to political independence from Rome. She conquered Egypt and much of the Eastern Roman Empire before the Emperor Aurelian counterattacked, defeated her armies, and destroyed Palmyra in 273 CE. The ruins that tourists visit today, the Great Colonnade, the Temple of Bel, the funerary towers, are the remains of a city that built its wealth on being in the right place on the right road, and lost everything when it confused commercial power with political power. The road survived Palmyra. The road always survived the cities that thought they controlled it. The Abbasid Golden Age and its trade foundations. The Islamic Golden Age, the century and a half between roughly 750 and 900 CE when Baghdad was the intellectual and commercial capital of the world, was funded by the Silk Road. The Abbasid Caliphate that replaced the Umayyad dynasty in 750 CE inherited control of the most lucrative trade routes in the world: the overland routes from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, the sea routes from the Persian Gulf to India and China, and the network of cities that processed and taxed the goods moving through them. The revenue this network generated paid for the translation programs, the observatories, the hospitals, the libraries, and the scholars that constituted the Golden Age. The caliphs who funded the House of Wisdom were not patrons of learning out of pure intellectual enthusiasm, though some of them were enthusiastic. They were rulers who understood that the empire's commercial position depended on its technical capabilities, on its ability to navigate, to calculate, to understand the geography of the trade routes, to develop the agricultural and medical and engineering knowledge that sustained the cities the trade required. The astronomy that Islamic scholars developed with such sophistication was applied astronomy. It was used for navigation, for determining the direction of Mecca from any point on Earth, for calculating the Islamic calendar. The mathematics was applied mathematics. It served commerce, engineering, and administration. The Golden Age ended not because of intellectual exhaustion but because of the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258. The city that had been the center of the world's most sophisticated commercial network was reduced to rubble in 2 weeks, its population slaughtered, its irrigation systems destroyed, its libraries thrown into the river. The trade routes that had funded the Golden Age did not disappear. The Mongols, who destroyed the city, were themselves the inheritors and continuers of the road. But the specific synthesis of commercial prosperity and intellectual ambition that had made Baghdad extraordinary was not reassembled. The Golden Age was over, and the road moved on without it. The Byzantine gold solidus, introduced by Constantine I in 312 CE, remained the dominant international currency of the Mediterranean world for 7 centuries, longer than any other currency in history. Merchants from England to India accepted it at face value because its gold content was reliably consistent, which was itself a remarkable achievement of state control over a mint that produced billions of coins over 7 centuries. When the solidus was finally debased in the 11th century under the pressure of military expenditure, The economic shock was felt across the entire trade network that had come to depend on it, a currency failure that contributed to the political crisis that eventually brought the Crusades to the Eastern Mediterranean. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 10. 10. The Mongols Who Built the Highway. Pax Mongolica and the Shortest Global Age in History. The Terror That Connected the World. Genghis Khan's armies arrived at a city in two modes. If the city surrendered, it was absorbed into the empire with its population intact, its trade networks preserved, its rulers replaced but its function maintained. If it resisted, it was destroyed, not damaged, not reduced, but destroyed, its population killed, its buildings leveled, its irrigation systems deliberately broken so that the fields could not be farmed again for a generation. The choice was absolute, and the Mongols communicated it clearly in advance, because the terror of destruction was itself a strategic asset. Each city that watched its neighbors raised calculated its own odds and often chose surrender. The result of this policy, applied systematically across Central Asia, Persia, China, and the Russian steppe between 1206 and 1260, was the creation of the largest contiguous land empire in history, an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River and that, for approximately 40 years in the middle of the 13th century, controlled more of the Silk Road than any single power before or since. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not peace in the sense of an absence of violence. It was the particular stability that follows total conquest, when there is one power and that power has demonstrated that resistance means annihilation, the roads are safe. The safety of the roads under Mongol control was not incidental. It was policy. The Mongols understood what every empire along the Silk Road had understood, that trade revenue required moving goods, and moving goods required roads that merchants could use without being robbed. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, maintained relay stations every 20 to 30 miles across the empire, staffed with fresh horses and riders who could carry messages from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months. Merchants with imperial passports, paisa, tablets of gold or silver that identified the bearer as operating under imperial protection, could travel the entire length of the road with a level of security that no previous generation of Silk Road merchants had experienced. The world that the Pax Mongolica connected. For the 40 years between roughly 1250 and 1290, after the conquest was complete and before the empire began to fragment into competing successor states, a traveler with an imperial passport could ride from the court of the Great Khan in Beijing to the court of the Illinois Khan in Persia to the court of the Khan of the Golden Horde in Russia without crossing a hostile border. This had never happened before in the history of Eurasian civilization, and it has not happened since. The consequences were immediate and, in some respects, more dramatic than the consequences of the Silk Road's entire previous thousand-year history. The volume of trade increased sharply. Merchants who had previously stopped at intermediate points to sell their goods, because the political fragmentation of Central Asia made further travel too risky, could now travel further and trade more directly. The flow of information accelerated. Travelers who made the full journey carried knowledge from one end of the world to the other in a single lifetime, producing the first generation of genuinely global observers. Marco Polo, who traveled from Venice to China between 1271 and 1295, was made possible by Pax Mongolica. The journey would have been impractical in any other political configuration of the Eurasian landmass. The Mongol court itself was a microcosm of the connected world it had created. The Great Khan's capital at Khanbaliq, modern Beijing, hosted Chinese administrators, Nestorian Christian clerics, Islamic scholars, Tibetan Buddhist lamas, and European ambassadors simultaneously. The Mongol rulers were religiously tolerant not out of philosophical conviction but out of imperial practicality. They needed experts from every civilization in their empire, and offending the religion of an expert was bad management. The result was a court that was more religiously and culturally diverse than anything the ancient world had produced, sustained by the wealth of a trade network that was finally operating at something close to its full geographic potential. A case study, Marco Polo and what he saw. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 at the age of 17, traveled overland to China through Persia and Central Asia, spent 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, and returned to Venice by sea in 1295. He was captured by the Genoese shortly after his return and spent time in prison, where he dictated his account to a fellow prisoner named Rustic Hello da Pisa, who added some literary flourishes and produced the book that became the Travels of Marco Polo. The Travels is the most important travel document of the medieval period and the most contested. Medieval readers were skeptical. The wealth of Kublai Khan's court, the scale of Chinese cities, the sophistication of Chinese administration all seemed too extraordinary to be believable. Modern scholars are divided. Some passages are clearly accurate and verifiable against Chinese sources, others are demonstrably wrong or appear borrowed from other travelers' accounts. Marco Polo did not mention the Great Wall, which is remarkable if he spent 17 years in China. He also did not mention tea, chopsticks, or bound feet, which are equally remarkable omissions. Whether he actually went to China or compiled his account from other sources remains a genuine scholarly debate. The 40 years of Pax Mongolica produced both the highest volume of trade the road ever carried and the most devastating pandemic it ever transmitted. Control and fragility went together. What is not in dispute is the book's historical consequence. Columbus carried a copy of the Travels on his 1492 voyage and annotated it with marginal notes. He was sailing west to reach the Cathay that Marco Polo described, the China of Kublai Khan's court, the source of silk and spice that the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople had made difficult to access by land. He found the Americas instead, which means that Marco Polo's description of Asia contributed, directly and specifically, to the European discovery of a continent that Marco Polo had never heard of. The Travels became one of the most consequential books ever written precisely because it was read, with burning attention, by a man who used it to sail in the wrong direction. The plague that rode the Pax. The Pax Mongolica's most terrible achievement was the acceleration of the Black Death. The same infrastructure that allowed Marco Polo to travel from Venice to Beijing, the relay stations, the imperial roads, the political unification of the steppe routes allowed Yersinia pestis to travel from the Central Asian rodent reservoir where it had been circulating for centuries to the ports of the Black Sea in a fraction of the time it would otherwise have taken. The Mongol Empire's destruction of the old political barriers along the Silk Road meant that the plague moved through what had previously been multiple distinct political zones, the Golden Horde's territory, the Illinois Khanate's territory, the fragmented Central Asian successor states, without encountering the kind of disruption that political borders had previously imposed on disease transmission. A pathogen that might have burned through one population and died out before reaching the next now had a continuous, high-traffic highway connecting every population in the Eurasian landmass. The Mongols who built the highway that carried the plague were themselves among its victims. The Illinois Khanate of Persia, one of the 4 successor states of the Mongol Empire, lost so much of its population to the plague in the 1340s that its economic and military capacity was permanently reduced. The Golden Horde, whose army had been besieging Kaffa when it catapulted its plague dead over the walls, was devastated by the epidemic that it had tried to weaponize. The road that the Mongols had made safe enough to carry the plague also carried the plague back into the populations that had built the road. This is not irony. It is the structure of connection. The highway that carries the goods carries everything. The end of the Pax and what remained. The Pax Mongolica ended not with a bang but with fragmentation. The empire that Genghis Khan had built was never designed to be governed as a single unit. It was too large, its populations too diverse, its geography too varied. After the death of the great Khan Monkey in 1259 and the end of undivided Mongol rule, the empire broke into 4 successor states that were more or less constantly at war with each other. The roads that had been safe under unified Mongol rule became contested again. The merchant with an imperial passport found that the passport was only valid in the state that had issued it, and the state that had issued it was at war with the state he needed to cross. What remained was not nothing. The Mongol Empire had permanently changed the political geography of Eurasia. It had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, ended the Khwarezmian Empire, weakened the Song dynasty, and created a new political landscape in which the successor states that emerged were fundamentally different from what had preceded them. The Ottoman Empire that eventually controlled the western end of the Silk Road was built partly on the ruins of the Byzantine and Seljuk states that the Mongols had weakened. The Ming dynasty that replaced Mongol rule in China was shaped by its determination to be everything the Yuan dynasty was not, which meant closing the road that had brought the Mongols' plague and the Mongols' culture and the Mongols' dominance. The Mongol Empire's great legacy was not the Pax Mongolica itself, which lasted barely 40 years, but the proof that the Silk Road could operate at a scale and efficiency that its fragmented political history had never previously permitted. The 40 years of Pax Mongolica showed what the road could be when a single power controlled it, and the devastation of the Black Death showed what the road was when it operated at that efficiency. The world had been connected. It had paid the price of connection. And it would spend the next 2 centuries trying to find a way to stay connected without paying that price again. The Mongol postal system, the YAM, was the fastest communication system in the world for the century of its operation. Relay riders could cover 300 miles per day, carrying urgent messages from one end of the empire to the other in less time than any subsequent communication technology until the telegraph. The system required an estimated 50,000 horses stationed at relay points across the empire, fed and maintained at imperial expense. When the empire fragmented and the central administration that maintained the stations collapsed, the system fell apart within a generation, leaving behind, in the form of roads and way stations and the memory of what fast communication felt like, the template that subsequent empires would try to replicate. Source: Empires of the Silk Road, Christopher Beckwith, 2009. Chapter 11. 11. The cities that grew where it stopped. Samarkand, Dunhuang, Constantinople, and the urban geography of the road. The city that the road built. Samarkand was the most beautiful city in the world. This was not a claim made by Samarkand's own citizens, it was a claim made by everyone who visited it. The Arab geographer Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the 10th century, described it as one of the glories of the Islamic world. The Mongol conquerors who destroyed it in 1220 were, by some accounts, briefly stunned by what they were destroying before they got on with the destruction. Timur, who rebuilt it in the 14th century as the capital of his empire, filled it with the artisans and scholars he captured in his conquests and made it the most sophisticated city between Constantinople and Beijing. It was beautiful because it was rich, and it was rich because of where it was. Samarkand sat at the junction of the main east-west route through Central Asia and the route south to Persia and India. Every caravan crossing Central Asia from China to the west passed through or near it. Every caravan going south from the steppe to the Persian cities passed through or near it. The merchants who stopped there to rest and resupply and sell their goods generated the revenue that paid for the mosques and the madrasas and the gardens and the ceramic workshops that made the city's reputation. The beauty was downstream of the geography. Samarkand was beautiful because the road stopped there, and the road stopped there because the geography required it. The cities of the Silk Road were all, in different ways, expressions of the same principle, that the wealth created by trade accumulates at the points where trade pauses. The oasis, the mountain pass, the river crossing, the harbor, wherever the movement of goods required a stop, a city grew to service the stop and extract value from it. The specific character of each city was determined by the specific nature of the stop it serviced, by the specific mix of civilizations whose goods it processed, and by the length of time it had been doing so. Dunhuang at the edge of the world. Dunhuang was the last Chinese city on the way west and the first on the way back. It sat at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The name means, in Uyghur, something like you go in, you don't come out, and it was the last place where a westbound caravan could resupply before the desert crossing and the first place where an eastbound caravan could recover from it. This position made it rich. It also made it cosmopolitan in a way that few Chinese cities were. The mix of languages spoken in the markets, the mix of religions practiced in the temples and churches and fire altars, the mix of textiles and goods and currencies that passed through its hands, were all products of being at the intersection of every civilization that used the road. The cave temples of Dunhuang, the Moguro caves, carved into a cliff face beginning in the 4th century CE and expanded continuously for the next 1,000 years, are the most complete physical record of the Silk Road's cultural mixing that survives. Buddhist imagery painted in a style that combines Indian, Central Asian, Chinese, and Tibetan elements. Donor portraits showing Chinese officials, Central Asian merchants, and Tibetan administrators side by side. Manuscripts in a dozen languages sealed in a cave and forgotten for 9 centuries. The caves are what happens when a crossroads accumulates 1,000 years of deposits, layer on layer of cultural exchange, each new layer not erasing the previous one but building on it. Dunhuang declined when the desert routes declined. The Ming dynasty's decision to pull back from Central Asia, to retreat behind the Great Wall and close the western frontier, left Dunhuang without its reason for existing. The city shrank. The caves were sealed, perhaps to protect their contents from the unstable political situation. The sand accumulated. By the 20th century, it was a small town in the middle of a desert, known for sand dunes and an ancient monastery, completely unaware that it sat on top of one of the most important archives in the world. Wang Yuanlu's accidental discovery in 1900 was the road reaching back across 9 centuries to remind the world that it had passed through here. The cities that disappeared. For every Samarkand and Constantinople that survived, battered, reduced, transformed, there are dozens of Silk Road cities that did not. The oasis towns of the Taklamakan Desert, whose ruins archaeologists have been excavating since the 19th century, were cities that flourished for centuries and then vanished, sometimes gradually as the water source that sustained them dried up, sometimes suddenly as political disruption made the route they serviced unviable. Naya, Lulan, Miron, these were cities that existed because the road needed them, that grew and prospered as long as the road used them, and that ceased to exist when the road moved or the water failed. Their ruins preserve, in the dry desert air, the physical record of urban life that the historical sources barely mention. The houses, the orchards, the Buddhist temples, the administrative documents in Kharosthi script, the personal belongings of people who left in a hurry or were buried under advancing sand before they could leave at all. They are the cities that the road forgot, preserved by the same desert that killed them. The road did not create tolerance. It created the material conditions in which tolerance was more profitable than its alternatives. The fate of these cities, built on trade, sustained by trade, abandoned when the trade moved elsewhere, is the fate of every city that has ever tried to build a permanent settlement on the foundation of a route that is, by its nature, temporary. Routes change. Water sources fail. Empires collapse. The cities that survive are the ones that developed economic foundations deep enough to outlast the trade that founded them. The cities that disappeared were the ones that were purely expressions of the road, with nothing to sustain them when the road moved on. The road was not cruel about this. It simply moved. What the road did to urban form. The cities that the Silk Road created had a distinctive urban form that reflected the specific needs of long-distance trade. The caravanserai, the inn that could accommodate a caravan of 200 camels and their drivers and their goods, was the basic unit of Silk Road urbanism, and cities organized themselves around it the way modern cities organize themselves around transportation hubs. The bazaar was another constant, the covered market where goods from different civilizations were displayed and exchanged, where different currencies were converted, where the specific commercial culture of the road, the art of bargaining across language barriers, the evaluation of goods from unfamiliar sources, the management of credit across civilizations with different legal systems, was practiced and transmitted. The architectural hybrids that the Silk Road produced, Buddhist cave temples painted in Chinese and Indian and Central Asian styles simultaneously, Islamic mosques with Chinese roof tiles, Christian churches decorated with Buddhist motifs, were the physical expressions of a cultural mixing that happened at the level of individual craftsmen working in traditions they had absorbed from the mixed urban environment of a trade city. The craftsman who painted the Dunhuang caves did not make a conscious decision to synthesize Chinese and Indian artistic traditions. He used what he knew, and what he knew was the accumulated visual vocabulary of a city at the crossroads of civilizations. The Silk Road cities at their best were the most cosmopolitan places in the pre-modern world, places where the assumption that people from different cultures, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, operating under different legal systems, could nevertheless do business together was not an aspiration but a daily reality. They were cosmopolitan not because their rulers were enlightened but because their location made cosmopolitanism economically necessary. The road did not create tolerance. It created the material conditions in which tolerance was more profitable than its alternatives. Timur's reconstruction of Samarkand in the late 14th and early 15th centuries produced the architectural monuments that still define the city's identity: the Registan, the Shahrizinda necropolis, the Bibi-Khanim mosque. He staffed the rebuilding with craftsmen captured in his campaigns. Artisans from Persia, India, and Syria were brought to Samarkand and put to work creating what Timur intended as the most magnificent city in the world. The result is one of the great concentrations of medieval Islamic architecture anywhere, built by a conqueror who combined extraordinary destructiveness with equally extraordinary aesthetic ambition. The Registan complex is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Timur himself is a national hero in modern Uzbekistan. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 12. 12. The Closing and What It Cost. The Ottoman Empire, Zheng his recalled fleet, and the end of the overland world. The door that closed. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II rode into Constantinople through a breach in the walls his cannons had made. He was 21 years old. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, built by Justinian 900 years earlier, dismounted, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Then he ordered the church converted to a mosque. The Byzantine Empire was over. The city that had controlled the western end of the Silk Road for 1,000 years was now in Ottoman hands, and the Ottoman Turks had different ideas about who should profit from the trade that passed through it. The Ottoman takeover of Constantinople did not close the Silk Road immediately or cleanly. Trade continued. The Ottomans were not hostile to commerce, they were, in fact, considerably more sophisticated commercial managers than the late Byzantine emperors they replaced. But they adjusted the terms: higher customs duties, stricter enforcement, less favorable treatment of the Italian merchant communities that had previously operated with near-total autonomy in their own quarters of the city. The Venetians and Genoese, who had built their commercial empires on preferential access to the Byzantine trade routes, suddenly found themselves paying more and receiving less. The Ottoman adjustment was enough to make the European merchants start looking for alternatives. Not because the overland routes were closed, they weren't, not entirely, not for decades, but because the margin had changed. Trade is driven by margin. When the Ottoman margins on the overland routes narrowed enough, the sea route became worth the risk. The Portuguese, who had been probing down the African coast since the 1420s, suddenly had a very strong commercial reason to find out what was at the bottom of Africa. Zheng his 7 voyages and their cancellation. Between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese Admiral Zheng he commanded 7 voyages of exploration across the Indian Ocean, reaching Arabia, East Africa, and possibly further. His flagship was 400 feet long, 5 times the size of Columbus's Santa Maria. His fleet on the first voyage numbered 62 treasure ships and over 20,000 men. He brought back giraffes and elephants and diplomats and tribute from 30 countries. He demonstrated, conclusively, that China possessed the naval capacity to establish commercial dominance over the sea routes that connected Asia to Africa to the Middle East. Then the voyages stopped. Zheng he died on the 7th voyage in 1433. The Yongle emperor who had commissioned the voyages died in 1424. His successors, influenced by Confucian scholars who regarded maritime trade as an undignified distraction from the proper business of governing the agricultural empire, cancelled the program, ordered the destruction of the ocean-going ships, and eventually made it illegal to build vessels with more than 2 masts. China, the civilization that had invented the compass and the rudder and the watertight bulkhead, voluntarily withdrew from the sea. The withdrawal was a civilizational choice with civilizational consequences. The sea routes that Zheng He had explored and dominated were, within 70 years of his death, occupied by Portuguese ships. The commercial dominance of the Indian Ocean that China had demonstrated and then abandoned was claimed by a civilization that had, in 1433, never sailed beyond the Mediterranean. The moment Zheng He's fleet turned around was the moment the center of gravity of global trade began its slow shift from Asia to Europe, not because Europe was more capable, but because China had decided it was not interested. A case study: the Portuguese route and what it changed. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and reached Calicut on the Indian coast in 1498. The journey took 10 months and killed a third of his crew. He returned to Lisbon with enough spices to pay for the expedition 60 times over. Within a decade, the Portuguese had established trading posts along the entire African coast and in India, and had deployed a naval strategy controlling the sea lanes with cannon-armed warships that the dhow-based traders of the Indian Ocean had no defense against. The consequences for the Silk Road were not immediate but were ultimately decisive. The sea route from Europe to Asia was longer in distance but cheaper in operation. Ships could carry larger volumes of goods than camels, they did not require the payment of customs duties at a dozen intermediate states, and they were not subject to the political disruptions that constantly threatened the overland routes. Once the Portuguese had demonstrated that the route was viable, the Venetians and Genoese who had built their commercial empires on the overland trade could see exactly what was happening to their business model. They were being bypassed. The road trained its own replacement. It gave the world the compass, the financial instruments, the commercial culture that made the sea routes possible. Then the sea routes made the road obsolete. The transition from overland to sea routes was not a single event but a gradual shift over half a century. The Silk Road did not close on a specific date. It simply became less profitable than the alternatives, and less profitable routes lose their traffic first at the margins and eventually at the center. The oasis cities that had been wealthy because of the trade they serviced became less wealthy. The merchant families that had specialized in overland trade diversified or went bankrupt. The caravanserais fell into disrepair. The road did not die dramatically. It faded, slowly, like a language losing its last speakers. What closed the road? The conventional explanation for the end of the Silk Road gives the Ottoman Empire and the Portuguese sea routes equal billing, but the two factors operated differently. The Ottoman factor was about margins. The road became more expensive to use, which pushed merchants toward alternatives. The Portuguese factor was about alternatives. Once a viable alternative existed, the road's higher costs became untenable. Neither factor alone would have ended the road. Together, they made its continuation economically irrational. The deeper factor was the Black Death. The plague that traveled the Silk Road in the 14th century killed so many of the specialized populations that sustained the road. The Sogdian merchant networks had been replaced by Persian and Turkic networks that were less deeply rooted. The Byzantine commercial infrastructure had been devastated, that the road's resilience was permanently reduced. Every political disruption that would previously have been a temporary setback became, in the post-plague world, a permanent contraction. The road that had survived the fall of the Han dynasty and the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Arab conquests did not survive the combination of epidemic, Ottoman expansion, and Portuguese competition. What closed the road, ultimately, was the success of what it had built. The financial instruments it had transmitted to Europe funded the Portuguese voyages. The compass it had carried west guided da Gama around the Cape. The commercial culture it had developed, the tolerance of risk, the willingness to invest in distant ventures, the institutional infrastructure of long-distance trade was inherited by the European merchants who used it to build the sea routes that replaced the overland ones. The road trained its own replacement. It gave the world the tools to make it obsolete, and the world used them. What the closing cost? The closure of the Silk Road was not only an economic event. It was a cultural event, and its cultural costs are harder to measure than its commercial ones. The road had been, for 1,000 years, the the primary mechanism by which the civilizations of Eurasia exchanged not just goods but ideas, technologies, religious traditions, and the kind of promiscuous cultural mixing that produces the most interesting human achievements. When the road closed, that mechanism of exchange was replaced by sea routes that were efficient for moving cargo but much less effective at moving culture. The sea route was a point-to-point connection. A ship left Lisbon and arrived in Calicut, and the contact between the two civilizations was mediated by the specific commercial and military relationship between the Portuguese and the Indian merchants they encountered. The overland road was a continuous connection, running through dozens of intermediate civilizations, each of which absorbed something from the traffic and contributed something to it. The cultural depth of the exchange on the overland road had no equivalent in the sea trade. The world that emerged from the sea route era was more globally connected in terms of trade volume and geographic reach than the Silk Road world had been. It was also more asymmetric. The sea routes were controlled by European powers whose relationship to the civilizations they traded with was defined by canon and contract rather than by the mutual dependence that had characterized the road. The Silk Road had been, at its best, a system in which no single civilization could dominate because every civilization controlled a segment of the route and could make the whole system more expensive for everyone else if mistreated. The sea routes eliminated this mutual dependence and replaced it with a hierarchy that was efficient, profitable, and devastating for the civilizations that found themselves on the wrong side of the canon. The 7 voyages of Zheng He were deliberately written out of Chinese historical memory by the Confucian scholars who succeeded the Yongle Emperor's court. The records of the voyages were destroyed or hidden, the shipbuilding plans were lost. When European historians began reconstructing the voyages from surviving sources in the 19th century, the scale of what China had accomplished and abandoned was genuinely shocking. The largest naval expeditions in history, abandoned 70 years before Columbus, forgotten so thoroughly that China itself had no memory of them. The Ma Huan, a Muslim interpreter who traveled on 3 of the voyages, left a detailed account that survived. Without it, the voyages would be largely invisible. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 13. 13. The Road Columbus Was Looking For. How the Silk Road's closure launched the Age of Discovery. The wrong direction. Columbus sailed west to find the east. This is the most famous navigational error in history, but it was not an error of ignorance. Columbus had the best maps available in 1492, he had read Marco Polo's account of the wealth of Cathay, and he had made the specific calculation that the distance between the Canary Islands and Japan was small enough to be bridgeable by his ship's provisions. He was wrong about the calculation, which is why he was surprised to find land where he expected open water. But his underlying premise was correct. Somewhere to the west was the Asia that the Silk Road had connected to Europe, and if the overland routes were blocked and the sea route around Africa was monopolized by the Portuguese, then sailing west was a rational attempt to find a third option. The Age of Discovery was, at its root, the Silk Road problem restated in maritime terms. The spices of the Moluccas, the silks of China, the cottons of India, the gems of Ceylon, these were not new objects of desire in 1492. They were the same goods that the Silk Road had been moving for 1,000 years, now inaccessible at reasonable cost because the overland routes had become too expensive and the sea route around Africa was a Portuguese monopoly. The Spanish crown that funded Columbus was not funding an adventure. It was funding a business proposal: find a new route to the sources of the goods that had made Venice and Lisbon rich, and capture the margin that those cities had been extracting. The connection between the Silk Road and the Age of Discovery is not merely chronological, the fact that one followed the other, but causal. The specific technologies that made oceanic navigation possible were Silk Road technologies. The compass that Columbus used to cross the Atlantic came from China via the Islamic world. The mathematical tools that navigators used to calculate latitude came from the Islamic astronomers who had been the custodians of Greek science and had extended it. The financial instruments that funded the voyages, the joint stock companies and letters of credit and insurance mechanisms, came from the commercial culture that the Silk Road had developed over 1,000 years. The Age of Discovery was built on the Silk Road's technological and institutional inheritance. What Columbus carried. Columbus's ships carried diseases as well as sailors. The smallpox and measles and typhus that European sailors introduced to the Americas, diseases to which the indigenous populations had no immune resistance, killed between 50 and 90% of the people they encountered within a century of first contact. This was not policy, at least not initially. It was the same mechanism that had operated on the Silk Road for 1,000 years, the movement of pathogens along the routes of human connection, operating at a scale and with a completeness that the Silk Road had never achieved because the Americas had been isolated from Eurasian disease pools for 12,000 years. The Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New that followed Columbus's voyage, was the largest single transfer of biological material in the history of life on Earth. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, and chili peppers moved east. Wheat, rice, cattle, horses, pigs, and a devastating suite of infectious diseases moved west. The consequences for human nutrition, agriculture, and demography were so profound that it is not an exaggeration to say that the modern world's population could not exist without the crops that the Columbian exchange distributed. The Silk Road had been doing a smaller version of this for 1,000 years, moving crops and animals and pathogens between the civilizations of Eurasia, but the Americas had been outside its reach. When Columbus's era connected the Americas to the Eurasian world, he completed the circuit that the Silk Road had been building for a millennium. The globe was finally, irreversibly connected. The question was no longer whether the world's civilizations were linked but who controlled the links. A case study, Portugal and the spice monopoly. The Portuguese strategy in the Indian Ocean was simple and brutal: establish control of the sea lanes with cannon-armed warships, destroy or co-opt the existing trade networks, and capture the margin that had previously been distributed among dozens of Arab, Indian, and Malay traders. By 1510, the Portuguese had established fortified trading posts at Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, and a dozen other strategic points, and were using their naval superiority to force merchants to pay for Portuguese passes to trade in waters the Portuguese had decided were theirs. The transformation of the Indian Ocean trade that the Portuguese accomplished in 2 decades was a preview of what European commercial expansion would do to the rest of the world over the following 4 centuries. The Silk Road model, in which multiple civilizations participated in a network of mutual benefit, with no single power controlling the whole, was replaced by a colonial model in which a single European power controlled access to the network and extracted rent from everyone who used it. The mutual dependence that had made the road a relatively equitable system, at least by the standards of pre-modern international relations, was replaced by a hierarchy that had no interest in equity. The civilization that benefited most from the road's inheritance was the one that had participated least in building it. Europe received the tools. Europe forgot where they came from. The spice trade that the Portuguese captured had sustained the Silk Road's eastern extensions for centuries. The pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon that moved through the Indian Ocean ports to the overland routes and eventually to European markets were the goods that had made the trade profitable enough to sustain the infrastructure. When the Portuguese captured the sea route and undercut the overland prices, they did not simply change the route, they changed the structure of the entire global trading system. The Silk Road's millennium of multi-civilizational mutual dependence ended not with a military conquest but with a price competition that the overland routes could not win. The New World and the Old Road. The silver that Spain extracted from the mines of Potosi in Bolivia in the 16th century flowed east across the Pacific on the Manila galleons that connected Acapulco to Manila and into the Chinese economy, which was the world's largest consumer of silver. The connection between the Americas and China, established within a century of Columbus's voyage, was in a sense the completion of the circuit that the Silk Road had been trying to close for 1,000 years, a direct link between the western extreme of human settlement and the eastern extreme, carrying not silk and spice but silver and manufactured goods. The Manila galleon trade, which operated for 2.5 centuries between 1565 and 1815, was the first genuinely trans-Pacific commercial route and the first direct connection between the economies of the Americas and Asia. It was also, in its structure, recognizably a Silk Road successor, long distance, high value, subject to enormous political and natural risks, sustained by the margin between the price of silver in the Americas and the price of silver in China. The merchants who ran it faced the same problems as the Sogdian merchants who had run the Silk Road. How do you manage trust, credit, and information across distances that make personal supervision impossible? The answer they found was the same answer: institutional intermediaries. The Chinese merchant networks in Manila, the Sangley, as the Spanish called them, performed the same function as the Sogdian trading colonies in Chang'an. They were the people who actually understood both sides of the transaction, who spoke the languages, who managed the credit, who bore the operational risk. The names had changed. The structure had not. The road had become the sea, and the sea had become a road, and the problem of connecting the world across distances that should have been prohibitive was the same problem it had always been. The invention of the modern world. The world that emerged from the age of discovery, the world of transoceanic trade, of European commercial dominance, of the Atlantic slave trade, of the plantation economies that fed industrial capitalism, was built on the foundation that the Silk Road had laid. Not because the road directly caused these things, but because the technologies, the institutions, the financial instruments, the geographic knowledge, and the commercial culture that made them possible were all products of the 1,000 years of connection that the road had sustained. The printing press that disseminated the geographic knowledge that made navigation conceivable required paper. Paper came from China via the Silk Road. The algebra that made celestial navigation calculable was an Islamic development transmitted to Europe through the Silk Road's cultural exchange. The compass that navigators used to cross the open ocean came from China via the Silk Road. The joint stock company that distributed the risk of oceanic voyages across multiple investors developed from the partnership arrangements that Silk Road merchants had been using for centuries. The world that Columbus made possible was, in its technical and institutional foundations, a Silk Road world operating with Silk Road tools. The irony, and it is a genuine irony, not a rhetorical device, is that the civilization that benefited most from this inheritance was the one that had participated least in building it. Europe was at the western terminus of the Silk Road, receiving end of the technological and cultural transfers that the road carried. It received paper and algebra and the compass and the commercial practices without contributing much to the systems that generated them. And it used what it received to build a global order that eventually dominated the civilizations that had built the road. The road made Europe. Europe then forgot the road. The Manila Galleon route, which connected Acapulco to Manila from 1565 to 1815, was the longest regular trade route in history, 8,000 miles across the Pacific, taking 3 to 4 months in each direction. The westbound ships carried New World silver. The eastbound ships carried Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. The silver that flowed into China through Manila was so large, some estimates put it at a third of all the silver mined in the Americas, that it became the primary currency of the late Ming dynasty, creating a monetary dependency on New World silver that made China economically vulnerable to disruptions in the Acapulco trade. The connection between Potosi and Beijing, established 2 centuries after the Silk Road's overland routes closed, was one of the first genuinely global economic dependencies in history. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 14. 14. The things we use that came from there. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, tea, sugar, and the debt we don't acknowledge. The inventory. Empty your pockets. Set what you find on a table. The phone contains components manufactured in China, assembled in a factory whose supply chains run across a dozen countries, charged by electricity generated in part by technology that traces to Chinese and Islamic innovations in metallurgy and chemistry. The coins, if you have any, are stamped with numerals that came from India via the Islamic world via the Silk Road. The paper in your wallet came from a technology transmitted from China to the Islamic world at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. If you have a hot drink, it is probably tea from China, along the road, or coffee, from Yemen, along the same routes. The sugar in it came from Southeast Asia via India, via Persia, via the Arab world, via the Mediterranean. The spices in your kitchen made the same journey. Your mathematical ability, your capacity to multiply and divide and calculate in your head rests on a positional notation system that came from India via the same route. The Silk Road is not history. It is the inventory of the present. The specific goods that traveled it are embedded in the material culture of every civilization that the road touched, in forms so thoroughly naturalized that their origins have become invisible. You do not think of your phone as a product of cultural transmission from the Tang dynasty. You do not think of your morning coffee as the descendant of a trade route through Yemen and Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. You do not think of the number 0 as an import. But they are, all of them, products of the movement of things along routes that connected the ancient world, transformed what they carried, and deposited the transformed versions at the ends of the earth. The debt that the modern world owes the Silk Road is not sentimental. It is structural. Remove the technologies, the crops, the financial instruments, the mathematical tools, and the commercial culture that traveled along the road, and the modern world is not diminished, it is unrecognizable. There is no printing press without paper. There is no navigation without the compass and the algebra. There is no industrial capitalism without the commercial practices that the road developed. The road is not background to the story of modernity. It is the precondition. Tea and the world it made. Tea was discovered, according to Chinese legend, by the Emperor Shennong in 2737 BCE, when tea leaves blew into a pot of boiling water. The legend is almost certainly false, but the fact it points to is not. China had been drinking tea for at least 3,000 years before the rest of the world discovered it. The Silk Road carried tea west and north to Tibet, where it became a staple food mixed with yak butter and salt, to the Turkish steppe, where it became the basis of a hospitality culture that persists today, to Russia, where the samovar became the center of domestic life, eventually to Britain, where the cup of tea became the organizing ritual of the day, the social lubricant of empire, the thing that made everything else manageable. The British tea trade remade the world. The East India Company's monopoly on tea imports to Britain generated revenues that funded the military and administrative machinery of the British Empire. The demand for tea drove the cultivation of opium in India, which was sold to China to pay for the tea, which produced the Opium Wars of the 19th century, which forced China to open its ports to foreign trade, which began the century of humiliation that still shapes Chinese foreign policy today. A plant that started in the mountains of Yunnan, traveled the Silk Road to the markets of the world, and ended up at the center of the global political economy of the 19th century, the chain of consequence that runs from the first Chinese cup of tea to the Opium Wars to the Belt and Road Initiative is unbroken. The specific social forms that tea created in different cultures, the Japanese tea ceremony, the Moroccan mint tea ritual, the British afternoon tea, the Russian samovar tradition, the Tibetan butter tea, are expressions of the same basic dynamic that the Silk Road always produced. A commodity moves from its place of origin, is adapted to the specific cultural needs of the places it reaches, and in the process of adaptation creates new cultural forms that then become traditions so deeply embedded that their origins are forgotten. The British do not think of tea as a Chinese import. They think of it as quintessentially British. This is what the road does. It moves things until they are everywhere, and then they are everyone's. A case study, sugar and the Atlantic world. Sugarcane originated in New Guinea, was domesticated in India, traveled to Persia with the Arab conquests, reached the Mediterranean with Islamic expansion, was planted in the Canary Islands by Portuguese colonists, was transplanted to the Caribbean by Columbus, and became the economic foundation of the Atlantic slave trade. The chain of transmission, from New Guinea to the Caribbean, taking 4,000 years and passing through a dozen civilizations, is the longest single journey of any crop in the history of agriculture, and every leg of the journey was a Silk Road transfer. The sugar economy that developed in the Caribbean and Brazil in the 16th and 17th centuries was not a product of the Silk Road directly. The road was already closing when the first sugarcane was planted in Hispaniola. But it was a product of the same impulse that had driven the road, the desire to access, at lower cost, the goods that made civilizations wealthy. Sugar had been a luxury good in the medieval world, available in small quantities at great expense along the Silk Road and its maritime extensions. The plantation economy of the Atlantic world made it cheap, universal, and central to the diet of the modern world at the cost of the Atlantic slave trade that made the plantations possible. The road moved things until they were everywhere. And when things are everywhere, they seem to have always been everywhere, and the movement that distributed them is forgotten. The specific path from sugarcane in New Guinea to slavery in Jamaica is not a story that the Silk Road tells directly. But it is a story that the Silk Road made possible, the movement of a crop from one civilization to another, the development of the commercial culture that could finance its expansion, the financial instruments that distributed the risk of the enterprise, the navigation technology that made the ocean crossing viable. All of these are Silk Road legacies. The Atlantic slave trade is the most terrible consequence of the system of global connection that the road built. It is also, inescapably, part of the road's inheritance. The foods that crossed the world. The specific inventory of what traveled the Silk Road and arrived in European kitchens reads like a menu of the modern world. Pepper from India, the most valuable spice in medieval Europe, worth its weight in silver, the primary reason the Portuguese risked the African Cape. Cinnamon from Ceylon. Cloves from the Moluccas. Nutmeg from the Banda Islands. Ginger from India. Saffron from Persia. Eggplant from India via Persia. Spinach from Persia. Oranges from China. Lemons from India. Apricots from Central Asia. Peaches from China. Cucumbers from India. Pasta, the noodle technology that became spaghetti, very possibly from China via the Arab world. Each of these foods carries within it the history of its journey, the specific route it took, the specific civilization that adapted it, the specific commercial relationship that moved it from its place of origin to its place of adoption. The word orange derives from the Sanskrit naranga via the Persian naranj via the Arabic naranj via the Spanish naranja, a linguistic fossil record that traces the fruit's westward journey from its South Asian origin to the Spanish orchards where it was growing when Columbus sailed. The orange you eat for breakfast is a Silk Road fruit, and its name is a map of the road. The paradox of the food legacy is that the very thoroughness of the transmission has made it invisible. The Italian who regards pasta as quintessentially Italian, the German who regards the potato as a German staple, the British who regard tea as British, all of them are consuming the products of a 1,000-year chain of cultural transmission that ended with the specific food so thoroughly integrated into the receiving culture that its foreign origin became literally unthinkable. The road moved things until they were everywhere. And then everyone forgot the road. What we owe and don't acknowledge. The narrative of Western civilization that runs from Greece to Rome to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution is not false. It is incomplete. It omits the inputs, the paper and the algebra and the compass and the crops and the commercial practices that came from the East along routes that Western civilization did not control and barely understood, and without which the narrative's decisive moments could not have occurred in the forms they did. This is not a claim about moral debt. It is a claim about historical accuracy. The specific form of modernity that emerged in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was not inevitable, was not purely a product of internal European development, and was not separable from the 1,000 years of technological and cultural transfer that the Silk Road had made possible. To tell the story of the modern world without the road is to tell a story with the scaffolding removed, a building that stands as if by magic, with no account of how it was built. The accounting matters not for the assignment of credit or blame, which are both too simple for what the road actually was. It matters because understanding where the things we use actually came from is the beginning of understanding how the world actually works. The world is connected. It has been connected for a long time. The connections run through places and peoples that the standard histories do not feature. And the things that flow through those connections, the technologies, the crops, the ideas, the financial instruments, become so thoroughly distributed that they seem to have no origin at all. The road made them originless. That was its greatest achievement. It is also the reason nobody remembers it. The word hazard comes from the Arabic azzar, meaning the dice, which entered the language through the medieval gambling games that were played at Silk Road caravanserais and eventually spread to Europe. The word check, as in checking a payment, checking the accuracy of something, comes from the Persian shah, king, via the chess term check, which entered European languages as chess traveled the Silk Road. The word magazine comes from the Arabic makazin, storehouses, which entered European languages through the same commercial culture. The Silk Road is in the language in hundreds of words that English speakers use every day without knowing their origins. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. Chapter 15. 15. The New Silk Road. Belt, Road, and the Return of the Oldest Strategy in History. The Announcement. In September 2013, Xi Jinping stood in Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan, the capital of a country that sits almost exactly on the ancient Silk Road, and announced the Silk Road Economic Belt. 1 month later, in Jakarta, he announced the Maritime Silk Road. Together, the two initiatives became the Belt and Road Initiative, a $2 trillion program of infrastructure investment across 60 countries, the largest single infrastructure project in the history of the world, explicitly framed in the language and imagery of the ancient Silk Road. The name was not accidental. Xi Jinping's speechwriters understood that the Silk Road carried enormous symbolic weight in the regions the initiative targeted, that Central Asian countries with Silk Road histories, that Southeast Asian countries with maritime trade histories, that African countries with Indian Ocean trade histories, all had reasons to associate the Silk Road with prosperity, cosmopolitanism, and connection to a larger world. The name also had domestic resonance in China. It invoked a period of Chinese cultural and commercial preeminence that the narrative of the century of humiliation had obscured, and it positioned the Belt and Road as a restoration rather than a novelty. Whether the Belt and Road Initiative is the restoration, it presents itself as a revival of the mutual benefit and cultural exchange that characterized the ancient road at its best, or the imperial project that its critics describe. A system for creating debt-dependent client states that serve Chinese strategic interests is a question that historians will be debating long after the current political moment has passed. What is clear is that the logic is ancient. Control the routes. Tax the traffic. Project power through commerce rather than conquest. Every empire that touched the Silk Road has understood this logic. China is implementing it at a scale that no previous empire achieved. The geography of the Brie. The Belt and Road Initiative's geography is the geography of the ancient Silk Road, expanded and updated for the 21st century. The land routes, the belt run from China through Central Asia to Europe, following the general alignment of the overland Silk Road but replacing camel tracks with high-speed rail lines and highways. The sea routes, the road, connect Chinese ports to Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa, and the Mediterranean, following the general alignment of the maritime Silk Road but replacing dhows with container ships and ports with deep-water harbors equipped with Chinese-built cranes. The specific projects that the BRI has funded: the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the rail line from China to Europe through Kazakhstan and Russia, the port at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, the port at Gwadar in Pakistan, the rail lines in Africa, are all expressions of the same underlying logic. That infrastructure creates dependency, and dependency creates leverage. A country that has borrowed Chinese money to build a Chinese-designed port operated by Chinese firms with Chinese security personnel is a country that has a specific relationship with China, a relationship that is commercial in its surface form and strategic in its deeper structure. The debt trap diplomacy that critics describe, in which countries that cannot repay Chinese loans are required to hand over strategic assets, is real in at least some cases. Sri Lanka handed the port of Hambantota to a Chinese state company on a 99-year lease in 2017 after finding itself unable to service the debt it had taken on to build the port. But the critics' framing is also somewhat misleading. The Sogdian merchants who built their trading colonies in Tang Dynasty China were also creating dependency relationships. and the Byzantine Empire that extracted customs duties from merchants who had no alternative route was also using commercial leverage for strategic purposes. The structure is old. The scale is new. The competition. China's Belt and Road Initiative has prompted a series of counter-initiatives from other major powers, all framed in similar language and all expressing the same underlying insight, that infrastructure creates influence, and the power that builds the world's infrastructure shapes the world's political economy. The United States announced the Blue Dot Network in 2019, followed by the Build Back Better World Initiative in 2021, followed by the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment in 2022. The European Union announced the Global Gateway in 2021. Japan has been investing in infrastructure across Asia for decades through its own aid and investment programs. The specific projects that these initiatives fund, clean energy, digital infrastructure, health systems, are different in character from the breeze ports and railways, reflecting different theories of what infrastructure matters most in the 21st century. But the underlying competition is ancient. Who controls the routes controls the world, and the routes of the 21st century are not only physical but digital, the undersea cables that carry the internet, the satellite networks that carry telecommunications, the data centers that process the global economy's information. The civilization that controls the routes collects the revenue, receives the intelligence, and projects the influence. The road is power. It has always been power. The Silk Road competition of the 21st century is being fought simultaneously on land, at sea, and in the electromagnetic spectrum. The players have changed. The stakes have expanded. But the logic is unchanged from the moment when the First Han Dynasty garrison occupied a watchtower at Dunhuang to ensure that the trade routes to the west remained open. The civilization that controls the routes collects the revenue, receives the intelligence, and projects the influence. The road is power. It has always been power. The only question is whose. What the past teaches. The ancient Silk Road's history offers several specific lessons for the Belt and Road Initiative and for the broader competition it has triggered. The first is about sustainability. The road sustained itself for 1,000 years not because any single power enforced it, but because it was mutually beneficial enough to sustain itself. When the road was controlled by a single power, as it briefly was under the Mongol Empire, it became more efficient but also more fragile. The 40 years of Pax Mongolica produced both the highest volume of trade the road ever carried and the most devastating pandemic it ever transmitted. Control and fragility went together. The second lesson is about trust. The road's commercial infrastructure worked because it was built on reputation networks that enforced obligation across distances where legal systems could not reach. The Breeze Current model, debt-financed infrastructure with Chinese contractors, Chinese workers, and Chinese terms, does not build the same kind of trust that the Sogdian merchants built through centuries of reliable performance. Infrastructure built by one party for the benefit of another party, financed by debt that creates dependency, is not the same as a network built by mutual investment for mutual benefit. The lesson of the Sogdians is that the people who run the network need to have their own interests aligned with its operation. The lesson of Palmyra is that the people who control a choke point should not confuse commercial leverage with political invulnerability. The third lesson is about time. The road's consequences were long. The technologies it transmitted took centuries to produce their effects. The crops it moved took generations to become staple foods. The financial instruments it developed took a millennium to become the modern banking system. The Breeze consequences will similarly unfold over decades and centuries, not years. The competition between China's infrastructure investments and the counter-initiatives of other powers will be settled not by the projects completed in the next decade but by the trust relationships built, the technologies transmitted, and the dependencies created over the next generation. The road was patient. Its successors will need to be. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which passed to a Chinese state company on a 99-year lease in 2017, sits very close to one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, the route through the Indian Ocean that carries oil from the Gulf to China and manufactured goods from China to Europe. The Chinese lease was framed as a commercial arrangement, Critics framed it as the first concrete example of BRI debt trap diplomacy. The specific terms of the arrangement are less important than what it represents: the use of commercial infrastructure investment to create strategic leverage, a technique as old as the Silk Road itself. The Venetians, who extracted commercial privileges from the Byzantine Empire in exchange for naval assistance, were doing approximately the same thing in 1082 CE. Source: The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, Peter Frankopan, 2015. Chapter 16. 16. What the Road Knew. Connection as Human Instinct, and the World We Built Because of It. The Last Caravan. Nobody knows when the last camel caravan crossed the Taklamakan Desert carrying trade goods from China to the markets of Central Asia. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no final traveler who knew he was making the last journey. The road did not end on a specific day. It faded, as all roads fade when the traffic moves elsewhere. First the big caravans stopped, then the medium ones, then the small ones, until finally there were only local traders making short hops between oasis towns, and the great chain of connection that had run from the Pacific to the Mediterranean for 1,000 years was just a memory in the minds of old men who remembered when the foreign merchants came. The Silk Road left behind a world so different from the one it had found that the difference is difficult to measure. In the 2nd century BCE, when the Han dynasty first projected military force into Central Asia to secure the western trade routes, the civilizations of China and Rome were separated by a distance that might as well have been infinite. They had no direct contact, no knowledge of each other's institutions, no shared technologies, no common diseases. By the 15th century, when the overland road was giving way to the sea routes, those civilizations shared paper, gunpowder, mathematics, agricultural crops, diseases, religious traditions, financial instruments, and the accumulated cultural memory of 1,000 years of exchange. The road had made them neighbors. What the road knew, what it demonstrated, over and over, across the full length of its operation, was that the human impulse to connect is stronger than the geography that separates. The Taklamakan Desert was not crossable in any comfortable sense. The Pamir Mountains were not hospitable to caravans. The political fragmentation of Central Asia was not favorable to long-distance trade. None of this stopped the road. The road went through anyway, because the desire to exchange goods, ideas, technologies, stories was more powerful than the obstacles in its path. The case for connection. The Silk Road's history is sometimes read as a cautionary tale about the costs of connection, the diseases that traveled with the goods, the plagues that killed the populations that the road had enriched, the cultural disruptions that followed the movement of religions and ideas across previously separate worlds. These costs were real. The Justinianic plague and the Black Death together killed more people than any war in the pre-modern period. The cultural disruptions that accompanied the spread of Islam and Buddhism reshaped civilizations in ways that their inhabitants did not choose and could not predict. But the case for connection is stronger than the case against it, and the Silk Road makes it more powerfully than any other single historical phenomenon. The paper that enables literacy. The mathematics that enables science. The crops that feed populations that would otherwise starve. The financial instruments that make investment possible. The religious traditions that give meaning to individual lives. The commercial culture that creates the trust networks that allow strangers to cooperate. All of these are products of the connection that the road sustained, and all of them are more important than the diseases and disruptions that accompanied them. The specific form of the argument is not that connection is always good or that its costs should be minimized. The specific form is that the alternative to connection isolation, the attempt to maintain the purity of a civilization by keeping it separate from other civilizations, has a cost that is even higher and less visible. The isolated civilization does not receive the diseases of contact. It also does not receive the paper, the mathematics, the crops, the financial instruments. It remains as it was. And in a world where other civilizations are exchanging, the civilization that is not exchanging is falling behind in ways it cannot measure because it does not know what it is missing. A case study: the Ming dynasty's withdrawal. The Ming dynasty that replaced Mongol rule in China in 1368 was, in its political psychology, defined by what it was not. It was not Mongol. It was not cosmopolitan. It was not outward-looking. The Mongol Yuan dynasty that the Ming replaced had been the most internationally connected Chinese dynasty in history. It was the dynasty that had welcomed Marco Polo, that had maintained trading relationships across the full extent of the Silk Road, that had been simultaneously the rulers of China and the inheritors of a Central Asian empire. The Ming reacted to this cosmopolitanism with a Chinese nationalist cultural program: Chinese culture, Chinese borders, Chinese people, Chinese values. The withdrawal was gradual but cumulative. Zheng He's voyages were cancelled. The ocean-going fleet was destroyed. The Great Wall was rebuilt and extended not against the specific nomadic threat that had always been the wall's stated purpose, but as a general statement of the Ming attitude toward the outside world: this is where China ends, and beyond this line is not our concern. The trade that had made Chinese cities wealthy continued, but under stricter state control and with less official enthusiasm for the foreign contacts that trade required. The road is not a historical phenomenon that ended in the 15th century. The road is what human beings do. It is what we have always done. It is, in some essential sense, what we are. The consequence, played out over the following 2 centuries, was that China was present at none of the crucial moments of the early modern world's development. The Portuguese rounded Africa. The Spanish reached the Americas. The Dutch built a commercial empire across Asia. The British East India Company established the infrastructure that would eventually make Britain the dominant global power. China, which had the technology to do all of these things before any European civilization, did none of them. The Ming dynasty's withdrawal from the road was a civilizational choice that had civilizational consequences. The road that China abandoned was used by others to build a world in which China eventually found itself on the losing side of the power relationships that the road had created. Connection as instinct. The Silk Road was not built by governments. It was built by merchants who needed to make a living, by monks who needed to find scriptures, by diplomats who needed to deliver messages, by refugees who needed to find safety, and by the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who had a specific reason to go from one place to another and who found, along the way, that the journey was possible. The road emerged from the accumulated decisions of individuals pursuing their own purposes, without any master plan, without any central authority directing the operation, without any of the apparatus of deliberate construction. This is what makes the Silk Road's history so instructive. It demonstrates that the human impulse to connect is not a policy choice but an instinct. Given the physical possibility of connection, given camels that can cross the desert, ships that can navigate the ocean, roads that can bridge the mountains, human beings will connect. They will trade. They will exchange ideas and technologies and stories and diseases and crops and gods. They will do this even when governments try to stop them, even when the journey is dangerous, even when the costs of connection include plagues that kill 1/3 of the population. The desire to connect is stronger than the obstacles to connection. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Internet, the global supply chains that make the modern economy possible, the migration patterns that are reshaping every major city on Earth, all of these are expressions of the same instinct that built the Silk Road. The specific technologies are different. The geographic scale is larger. The speed is incomparably greater. But the underlying dynamic is unchanged. Human beings want to connect, and they will build whatever infrastructure is necessary to make connection possible. The road is not a historical phenomenon that ended in the 15th century. The road is what human beings do. It is what we have always done. It is, in some essential sense, what we are. The world the road made. The world you are living in was built, in significant part, by the movement of goods and ideas along a route that most people cannot locate on a map. The paper this book is printed on descends from a Chinese technology. The numbers in the chapter headings descend from an Indian technology transmitted through the Islamic world. The crops that fed the population that built the civilization that produced this book traveled the road from the east. The financial instruments that funded the enterprises that made the book's production economically viable were invented along the road and transmitted west through intermediaries whose names nobody remembers. The road is invisible because it worked. It moved things until they were everywhere, and when things are everywhere, they seem to have always been everywhere, and the movement that distributed them is forgotten. The Italian who eats pasta, the German who eats potatoes, the British who drinks tea, none of them think of themselves as the inheritors of a long chain of transmission that began in China or Peru or India and ended in their kitchen. The transmission was so complete, and so long ago, that the origin is irretrievable in ordinary experience. But the origin is there. The road is there, in the language and the food and the mathematics and the financial architecture and the material culture of the modern world. It is there in the fact that you can communicate with someone on the other side of the world in seconds, and in the fact that the technology that allows you to do this was built in a country that learned to make microchips from a country that learned electronics from another country in a chain of transmission that does not have a clear beginning. The road never ended. It became the world. The world is still moving. The word Silk Road itself, Seidenstrasse in German, was invented by the geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877 as part of his argument for German commercial expansion into Central Asia. He chose the word silk because it was glamorous. The road was actually called many different things by the people who used it, none of which have survived as general terms. The Sogdians who ran it had no collective name for it. The Tang dynasty Chinese who taxed it called it the Western Routes. The Islamic geographers who mapped it described specific segments. It was only in the 19th century, when European scholars began trying to understand the connections between the ancient civilizations they were studying, that the concept of a single road emerged, invented, like most concepts, to explain something that had already happened. Source: The Silk Road, A New History, Valerie Hansen, 2012. The complete book is available in our store, link in the description below. Subscribe for more history, and we'll see you in the next one.